Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the transcript from the Metatron's video titled Were the Ancient Romans Nordic, which he uploaded a couple of days ago. First of all, I would like to stress this: I never made a video commentary on the Metatron's channel. You know that in general I don't do this stuff, right? And it's a channel that I watch at some point in my life. I know what he does. I think he's a good guy, so this video is going to be critical things he says, but I'm not, let's say, specifically going after him or, acting sarcastic or in weird ways, etc. I will just speak my mind on certain things that I say, quite immediately are wrong. In other ways, I think they're misrepresented. And some of which, given that we'll read the whole thing, I will heartedly agree on. In fact, this video is not really trying to prove, for example, the Nordicity of ancient Romans, and I'll have enough, probably as you see already from the size of the video, enough chance to speak my mind about this, right? And I'll try to be as, say, neutral as possible, because I don't have any other reason behind this. Now everything will be clearer looking at this video. So, were the ancient Romans Nordic? I'll simply present his video through the introduction that he makes in a very useful fashion, so we just read the transcript. Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we are continuing a dedicated series to uncovering the truth based on facts and documented evidence, while at the same time dismantling politically charged propaganda lies aimed at rewriting history, and we'll do this with reason, logic, and correctly contextualized primary sources. Okay, let's assume that's the thing. I would like to begin this presentation by saying that lies are lies, and it doesn't matter which side of the political spectrum they come from. And I like what he writes here, because he is really targeting all the sort of white as black supremacist ideologies and so on. It says we're always prepared to attack them without hesitation, and I agree wholeheartedly with that. The idea that the ancient Romans belong to the Nordic phenotypic type is part of a theoretical system which, generally speaking, was born in Germany and fostered by the likes of Hans Friedrich Karl Günther. We are specifically referring to the set of theories called Nordicism. Right? The idea, he says, that of ancient Romans being Nordic with a stronger emphasis of the ruling elite is an actually pretty easy argument to attack, and I agree on this, except let's see how he does it, because here I have a first perplexity, that is to say, the ancient Romans being Nordic with a stronger emphasis on a ruling elite. So the video, I'll say it, doesn't quite address the chronological spectrum, nor addresses the origins of the Italic peoples and the Italian peoples as a whole. It's more like, and I understand this because it's just a 20-minute video, so my advice is always, do not address such topics in 20-minute videos. I know that this is a very popular channel, and so part of the reason it's also because things are digestible, and there is this sort of gotcha, sort of checkmate, as he actually says at some point, that gives the impression that, okay, we are uncovering the truth. Well, okay, yes, but let's see how this is done. And so I am perplexed by the fact that, the, say, Nordicistic theory that has some ranges, and of course it is somehow heavily biased and so on, but ever truly publicized the concept that the Romans, at a point, even just in their Italic background, were an essentially Nordic people. This is something that, frankly, I've never appreciated from even that background. I mean, I think that these are the authors that we'll see now, famous racialists or racists, if you prefer, were referring to a specific dynamic within the European continent that the Metatron's video doesn't quite take into consideration, and that by degree, yes, of course, here it's as many historical debates, the story of the half full, half empty glass, right? What does it mean? The idea of the Romans being Nordic, how? That at some point, the Roman Italic people were literal, I don't know, Norwegians, right? This is not something that was ever said, right? Some of these authors' ideas, in spite of being very ideological and very biased, of course, were based on actual historical evidence. So I understand it's a 20-minute videos. It's something that you can debunk in a broader sense. Yes, we should not make people think that in 2023, yes, there was such a thing, like, all Norse people in Italy, and at some point things got diluted, which is something that, as you know, I addressed in my videos, but it's a tiny more complicated than what the Nordicists themselves, in all their rigged interpretation, were actually saying. So I would really be careful with that. But we'll see it now. So I know it's a huge video. I don't expect a response, by the way. I don't care if it does. I'm glad, but it's not the point. It's more a way that through which I illustrate how I think history should be discussed on the internet, and unfortunately it takes a lot, because liquidating things with certain phrases doesn't help to make people actually understand what the deal is and why certain things were said, and this could actually make it even worse than it already is if there is any substantial bias of this kind, right? So the Metatron says, in order to attack this topic, say, this argument, professionally, we're going to utilize a systemic data analysis model in order to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the claim, while at the same time checking its propaganda subroutines. Like, okay, I understand that, but having watched the video, I know that this is not really what happens, right? Especially in a 20-minute one. In any case, we will see, in fact, what method he uses and how it could be paradoxically by just following that debunked by the same Nordicists. So that's something I would like to make a bit more nuanced. Now, we will also see whether or not this argument is contradictory in its premises once looked upon through the perspective, period, iconography, literary material evidence, including DNA analysis. Yes, except it's not that much time is actually dedicated to do that. So we will call this a logic investigation sequence, a consistency check criteria. All right. So this was the introduction, right? And the Metatron uses this this interest to make very clear that he is educated, he has a university background, he is after scientific objectivity, so all commendable, right? I'm lazy, I don't do this stuff, I just come here and talk. I will be quoting, citing. So some of you ask, but Schwerpunkt, you often don't use actual sources. Well, I will this video explicitly, because it's the kind of content that requires that. If I'm making a basic manualistic history, I will not descend into that necessarily, even though I actually do. But this is interesting. So, and by the way, I plan on to make a specific video on this very topic, like not the Nordicistic thing, but like, what is that actually the Romans said about themselves, right, and their appearance regarding, yes, also the sort of Nordicistic trait. I will explain why this is controversial, even just to attack as a Nordicistic point, because this is a concept that actually exceeds Nordicism. It's something that can go into Arianism, and you have to understand there even what we're talking about by these peoples, and so I think that this was not properly done. So the Metatron will excuse myself if I'm critical, etc. But I have my channel and work like this. So he goes, the past is a dynamic continuum as humans stride across the centuries, a complete ethnic monolithic folk. Here I don't know, because the transcript is also weird, and I listened, of course, all of it, but there's basically the only word I think that I haven't understood from the video. Of civilization, particularly when core societies become multicultural due to foreign individual relocation patterns, right? So little note here, societies are, let's say, always the same concept of the half full and half empty glass, right? Every society taken in itself can be seen as both communitarian and multicultural. Right? You can't think that, yes, there is a degree of cohesion, of homogeneity, etc., and you can see how, however, it's still composed by something. And of course, every, let's say, historical time, historiography, as the Metatron also discusses, is something that had its own agenda in some ways. And I don't think, say, when we talk about propaganda, etc., one thing is, say, going back to the etymologies, propaganda can be, it's of course used today to intend something sort of fallacious or, distorted, manipulated for some purpose, but you can propagate, disclose information also if it is actually correct, right? So there is no such thing, and I think he quotes the truth again, and that's where I want to make a much more important point about the historical method, because that certain things do not ring right here. You can always interpret a society in a multicultural sense as in the opposite communitarian sense, depending on which side you take, even just methodologically, not necessarily in a... It becomes automatically political and ideological, right? It doesn't have to be particularly loaded in that for doing this. So it's let's stay very clearly focused on the fact that it doesn't take to quote, right, to cite, to necessarily break, oh, look, I'm saying this study exists or this source exists, because in the very moment you do that, you're actually selecting something, and if you do not explain why you're doing that, and you leave a lot out, and you give some explanations that, can easily be debunked, the point is, yes, we're uncovering the truth, but how, right? Because that's how I was told to work, and I see here the video is pretty popular, but I fear that it can lead people astray in certain fashion. In any case, he says conquest, citizenship extensions, and other factors, well, make it difficult to identify, but let's say this dynamic is usually present. Power, success, and wealth attract immigration. The city of Rome also attracted immigration throughout its history, particularly from several different types of populations and civilization across the Mediterranean basin, and not only, of course. Hence, a certain level of cosmopolitanism would have been encountered within the city. All right. However, at least when it comes to the Italian Romans, a long-lasting continuum of the genetic fabric of the population appears to be demonstrable regarding of barbaric invasions, slave influx, and other external demographic pressures. Now, this is a very important point on which I agree with Metatron on. It is true that essentially the Italian population intended as the peoples that inhabited in within the boundaries of today's Italian Republic are fundamentally the same, right, as in the basic genetic pool that were at the time of, say, Augustus, right, and before, as the same Metatron points out later on. Yet this is, while the most important piece of information ever discussed on the channel, this is true, I think, first of all, for most countries in Europe, to different degrees, but especially in the, say, in historically sedentary parts, and especially in the West, in the South, this is definitely more pronounced. We will see how this doesn't quite rule out what a certain part of the Nordicistic theory is more broadly founded on. It's not even call it Nordicistic, not necessarily Arianistic or Indo-Europeistic, but say we just know it that Eurasia was constantly, let's say, characterized by waves of peoples from the steppes areas that pushed east or west, and many times in the last millennium that, of course, left a trace that surely had something to do with the elites that ruled eventually the century people. So this is something I will discuss specifically later, but that's fundamentally what Nordicism, even though in a more loaded and biased sense, was talking about. Of course, Metatron doesn't actually speak about this in the video. I understand the reason, because it's just like one of, okay, the ancient Romans were not blacks, so the ancient Romans were also not Nordics, yes, I understand the kind, but there would be much more to say, because the two things, also sorry, I'm not interested in the topic per se, but are very unbalanced towards, of course, the Caucasian dimension of Europe, and also this concept of Mediterraneity that, as we will see, is thrown around as a sort of, there is such a thing like a Mediterranean people. I think it's very difficult to defend as well, right? Especially when we get to the cultural root of the thing, right? This video doesn't distinguish much in terms of genetics, of broader culture, of language, etc. So I know that Metatron knows about this. I know that he was not planning to explain this in the video, but just the way it came out, right, could be misleading in some ways. So he goes on and says, in other words, the imprint that these socio-political phenomena had on the original population chains is not zero, obviously, but it's negligible when looked at the entirety of Roman history. And this is correct, right? And this is correct also, as we were saying, just for the rest of Italian, and I think the overwhelming majority of European history, like picked in a geographical sense, right? There would be something to say, of course, also about the Romano-Italic influence, especially in Western Europe, differently from the eastern part of the empire, for example, but this is not for today. And then the Metatron goes at it, says, however, a claim such as the Roman were Nordic before immigration and foreign influx within the population ethnic strata requires a statistically significant core of identifiable factors in order to be sustained. Thus, any form of discrepancy between the observable data and the theoretical postulation basis will have to be negligible for the hypothesis to stand, right? And this point is also particularly important because, unfortunately, genetics doesn't tell us everything. Right, I will not digress on the incredibly complicated issue of, oh, look, I made this, DNA test, from a company online, and it turns out that I'm 50% this and 25% that. That's not exactly what, how, and even admitting that it's not a fraud most of the times, because I've really, come to know very strange things, including sort of different same people, say brothers, things like that made these tests and were a bit too, different in outcome than they should have been, etc. But this is a completely different issue. The point, though, is that we cannot quite easily characterize people's movements merely from genetic background, at least for the evidence that we can collect from the ancient world. Of course, there is plenty of genetic evidence about who certain people was, etc. But the distribution, like in the finds, in the problems we have with dating, with human mobility, say that just the dynamic through which we get to know of that specific community, that specific remains or another, is something that complicates a bit the situation. What we do know, however, and again, we will see it in the end, is that yes, there is a substantial continuity with a previous stratum, and this is really a basic continuity actually, and this is no mystery, right? And for many reasons, again, that I can't quite explain, but say if you go to an academic and you say, well, this seems to be the case, well, yeah, but we know that from quite a while. It's not really just a matter of guess. In any case, he goes on and says, moreover, in order to determine the ethnic consistency of Italian Roman people, we will make use of several resources. As we mentioned, literary evidence, iconographic evidence, genetic evidence, then we will formulate a consistent hypothesis based on the examination of all reliable information. Well, in a 20 minutes video, you cannot do any of that, first of all, in a serious way, in any way. What this video boils down to is fundamentally some literary evidence that actually crosses out the quite explicit reference to the even blondness. That, of course, we're not saying that is the case. Through the Metatron's methodology, we will see that that's exactly the same point that he's making, right? I find this, so it means that. So it's false, it's debunked. They are telling us that that this is not how it works. And especially when you have a lot, but really a lot of information in all Latin literature and beyond of some phenotypic characters of the Roman people, and especially of the archaic ones, right? I understand that the early empire is the one that sort of pulls more. I'm very much into archaic history when it comes to Rome and the foundation of the same empire. And of course, I'm also more sensitive to the Indo-European migration, all this stuff that is actually not discussed in the video in a way. And of course, as we will see, he makes the point that, yes, there are exceptions, whatever, but this is, even though it's a video that is just aimed to debunk the fact that the Romans were old Nordic people at some point in Italy, I think that nobody ever claimed such a thing. So what was even the point of this, when actually there is a much more nuanced picture from the same evidence that you are, the type of evidence that you are providing, that you're not analyzing in its entirety, nor actually even in the most poignant aspects, right? Literary evidence, okay, iconographic evidence, as we'll see, the guy uses, of all the Roman civilization, just the Pompeii frescoes that actually show the majority of people having actually a fair complexion. It could easily be even Scandinavian people. I mean, I'm not making the case that they kind of were, but artistically, etc., that's not the best evidence, especially when you have plenty of, busts. It's not just about color, obviously. And this is something that the Nordicists were quite fixated about, the actual facial skeletons, the actual look. Like if you look at some Roman busts or from Caligula, etc., it's difficult not to see a certain ideal, at least in the rendition. And of course, there are lots of other people that do not look that sort of Aryan. But there is a reason why, let's say, somebody came up with those ideas, and I think that that must be very carefully handled, but still they have something to, at least a specific concept of Roman self-representation, what they actually thought, right? I have a lot of stuff on my channel about these topics, and I will keep making that, but let's say I can't even explain this properly in a few hours, right? I hope that this can help sort of contributing to unveil the truth, the Metatron we talk about, because I do believe there is a truth as well. Just perhaps I have a different sense of how you can get there, if any. Also, the genetic evidence is the studium, the study that he mentions at the end, right? So, yeah, there are many other studies, but he doesn't even enter into the specificities. It's fine. I actually agree with the general tendency of those studies, so he was perfectly fine in bringing them up, right? That's how I would quote that randomly in one of my videos, and people will say, well, where do you get that from? Well, these things do exist. Yes, I don't have to cite every single damn thing in order to make a credible statement, especially given that I earned a bit of my background, I would say, and not necessarily on YouTube, for those who don't know. So saying again that we will make a consistent hypothesis, man, I understand it, but these things are well established, say, theories, right? At least there is an hypothetic dimension to them, but let's say we're not really unveiling. So I know it sounds cool for the audience and whatever, but saying this, examining all reliable information, eventually you don't, like, what's the point of it? You don't even actually explain why you use one source rather than another, and it's a sort of gotcha thing. It actually crossing out the very evidence that is saying the opposite of what you're claiming. So again, it's not defending Nordicism in this sense. It's just making the point that if you want to attack certain ideologies, well, because usually I think the Metatron's videos are craftily done, right? Like for this one, I can't say well done, but he's one of the few that really makes something in order to provide with that sense of reliability, and I estimate him for that. But again, the outcome is another, and so if we just go by giving pats on each other's shoulders, I don't think it's going to be very useful for the audience in the first place. So he goes on and says, and as we proceed without investigation, let's keep in mind one thing: there is no my truth or her truth, there is only objective truth, and today we will find it. Alright, yeah, this is the things I don't like when we get to this point. There is no such thing like the punishment moment. Let's find who is an idiot, who is not. I do believe in an objective truth, right? Except I think that it's too often beyond our poor cognitive means, and even though we can approach it, at least we should make a hell of an effort that here, as we will see, is not quite being done, and claiming just to find the truth in a 20-minute video about such a hugely complex issue that overall, yes, can be, say, in the Nordicistic bias debunked, but in a lot of other things that are still being massively researched, as far as Roman, European, and broader world history are concerned, I don't think that this is the way to approach the topic. If anything, for respect for our craft, because I think I don't know this really, but I think Metatron is either a philologist or a linguist or an archaeologist. I don't think he's a historian, but let's say we do pretty much the same thing when it gets to what we tell on YouTube, and so I think this sort of there is definitely no such thing like subjective truth. That by definition is not true, but again, how can you claim that you are devoid of this and you can find the truth? Do not say that, right? Especially when it gets down to something like this. So he goes on and says, historically, all sort of political groups on all sides often made use of vague statements as a form of mass manipulation. Well, exactly, just the ones like I pointed out. Due to the general lack of resource access and higher understanding of these historical concepts by the masses. This one I like because, as the most affectionated followers know, I'm always complaining about the fourth estate having ruined everything in the world, and people being dramatically undereducated and all this stuff. So I appreciate that the Metatron points out that yes, there are reasons why this happens. I don't think it's actually general lack of resource access. I think that even with fairly modest means, a person could educate themselves today, but yet the point is that they will actively pursue like the distortion of ideas, because that's the sort of what they're out there in the first place for. And so if they're not adequately trained and educated, I understand that they will make a mess. But if this video is the proof that should, what should be the opposite, I'm not sure that we're getting too much out there. And I'm not saying this in the sense that the Metatron is a mass manipulator, that he's heavily biased. I don't think. I only believe that he, in a video like this, wants to make, again, the simple point, after all, yes, this is the debunked point, end of the story. And saying things in the process that are actually wrong from a historical point of view. And I will explain them now. I need to make all these premises because it's not that I don't want to come off as arrogant, because if I make a video like this, of course, I have my degree of combativeness, etc. But say it's not because I'm searching for, I want to smash, I want to destroy the Metatron, whatever. I don't give a damn about this. I care about history, which is a different thing. And I don't even care that much about the views, because all I like is, to make history. And today I actually was lazy to prepare another video, so I decided just to make this debunkment sort of thing, which may be a filler also in the future if you like the genre. And so yes, the masses are generally speaking scumbags, let's be honest. Furthermore, the Metatron says, if the Romans were indeed Nordic, we would also need to see a high level of Germanic social linguistic interference and cultural heritage. Alright, and this is a fair point, right? Because here we're not talking about Indo-Europeans, we're talking about the Nordics, right? So more or less we're talking about North Germanic people. So were the Romans initially North Germanic people? No, right? We'll see this better. The point, though, is that we should understand, given that the video follows just a sense of whiteness as if it was concentrated exclusively in the north of Europe, something that probably could be misleading. Meaning what? That, as you know, the Indo-European peoples, as you know, were believed truly by some of these authors, that also the Metatron quotes, that the actual origin of white people, like probably the whitest people were sort of this people had been born, was actually Scandinavia. It was actually this far north, and there is a lot in many legions of the Indo-European peoples and beyond that, of course, refer to a broader north end of the Hyperborean Sea, etc. And it's true, those scholars were all about them, right? And we can easily locate it. I don't know if you think about the Vedas in India, something across, beyond the mountains, but definitely not in Scandinavia, but in the steppes somewhere. And this is the Kurganic, essentially, theory, so that the so-called Aryan people would have actually originated in this, where we call them Caucasians, because it's something like between the Don and the Caspian Sea, north of the Caucasus. And there was a bit of a problem, especially in for example, Nazi times, where still these ideologues believed that effectively the true original, say, region of the genetic region of the white people was Scandinavia, as opposed to what's later, ironically at the time, in the Soviet Union, so against those peoples that were considered an inferior race and so on. And this, of course, like to their answer, say, well, they were polluted later on, whatever. And yeah, we're not here to discuss that, because it's really for other videos, and for today, it's already too much what we're looking at simply right now. There is another point, though, that the Nordicists, of course, were thinking that there could have been specifically at some point before the Indo-European migration into Italy that happened sometime obscurely, because it's not documented, and that's the greatest problem we have, even with genetic evidence, what actually happened. This is true also for the Yamnaya, for the corded ware culture, etc. So we will come back to this at some point, because there are such thin threads that if you actually look at the historiography on it, it's all just hypotheses, right? Some are better than others, they're sort of more matching, but there are big doubts regarding where, for example, did the Italic people effectively come. Some say Central Europe overall, which is also more or less in the same locations for which other peoples historically migrated into Italy later on, settling there. Some say that they came from the Balkans. This would be evidenced by a greater concentration of, say, fair phenotypes from the Adriatic coast. Others say that actually they went as far as, and I think these Nordicists were a fan of that, saying that the Latino-Faliscans specifically, that differ within the Italic branch of the Indo-European peoples from the Oscans, the prevalent one on the Adriatic, that in fact were on the Tyrrhenian, is that they were actually of, say, Nordic ancestry, and or at least that they descended from, they went down, say, from the north of Europe in more or less the same longitude of Italy. So not really coming from the east, right? Like, I think most scholars today think actually the Italics came from, like, the Balkans fundamentally, but even there, from where? Because the land route is still passing through northern Italy in the east. It was the typical route of invasion also later on. But nobody can demonstrate that. So if you don't want to be particularly picky about Nordic versus sort of Aryanist, etc., the idea would be that actually the whitest people ever would have sprang again from this genetic migration that would have occurred north of the Caucasus. And yes, as we'll see now, the Metatron emphasizes the fact that there was also some sort of Germanic nationalism specifically, so not really championing those who were coming from the east, from these migrations mostly. And this, of course, means that, however, the Nordicism, the whiteism, if we can say, could still be applicable in the measure in which certain groups, right, of warlords coming from the steppes and or having sedentarized gradually over time, having moved into Central Europe, wherever, would have eventually invaded Italy. And that's also the reason why culturally, Italian is an Indo-European language as opposed to the ones that were spoken there before. And so why this cultural superiority that eventually did leave that mark would have of course mixed with lots of other influxes, and this is particularly evident in Roman culture, not only among all the Indo-European speaking populations in Europe, would have absorbed still an enormous lot of the previous culture that would have remained significant. There is also, however, the problem of the conquest and how this happened. We're not really informed, but we can see many different patterns throughout history, even during the migration era, etc., where when you do actually have, say, just to stick to Italy, as you know, I'm a medievalist, I make a lot of migration era warfare, of course, like Romance people, the same Romans in Italy, were the overwhelming majority compared to the Longobards, were actually the largest group that ever migrated during the migration era. Something like a few points percentage of the entire Italian population. But you have the Romans effectively becoming Germans. I made multiple videos about this from a juridical point of view, because they were the Longobards then and not the Romans anymore. They spoke Roman. They were largely the same descendants from the peoples that had, say, from Romance people, from Italic peoples, from other Romanized peoples, just sticking just to the language and the broader identity. And it's still identified at that point as Longobards, right? So this is absolutely nothing strange. It's the same idea for which we speak Indo-European languages in Europe. It's not that at some point the continent was replenished just by Indo-Europeans and all the rest had died or escaped. It's obviously a matter of cultural supremacy and hegemony coming from invaders, and we see it really at very big length out there. By the way, the notion here that there would have not been any Germanic influence within the Roman world, and I think here the Metatron is speaking especially from a linguistic point of view, may not be the best way to try to debunk this, because when this migration happened, of course, the various branches of the Indo-European peoples had not yet fully formed, right? We talked of a proto something of that, but we do not actually know, and there is no clarity whatsoever, and notoriously in historiography, on when, how this branches split. Like we mostly, of course, see these branches only after they had established themselves into different regions, and thus normally had began to speak different variations. What was, however, an originary common language, largely, right, give or take, of course, because there are always different groups. There is no doubt about this, but if you look at Roman, Celtic, Germanic etymologies, I'm a fan of compared Indo-Europeistics, and I can definitely say that certain words are practically the same, right? So you don't need a Germanic influence there. You don't necessarily have a guy coming from Scandinavia and founding Rome. First of all, because we have literally no evidence of that. But this would have occurred at such an early time in history that we couldn't document it anyway. And of course, that element would have diluted along the way. And actually, there are legitimate theories that explain how this steppes conquerors and their successors, they're more warlike peoples. It's something you can see during the migration era. You don't have to be the more civilly developed people to overwhelm another and to impose your, say, to affirm your cultural values, also because the people fundamentally accept that there are people who say that essentially the Chinese Empire was founded by Aryan conquerors. It's undemonstrable, but it's not out of the range of actual historical plausibility, right? It remains there. It's just an hypothesis, and it remains that because there is no way to demonstrate that, but it doesn't mean that it's not true in a broader sense. Besides, there is an actual study. I have it here somewhere, but I think it's the only one, and so if you ask me now if I can find it, but it's famously the only one, I think, existing around this topic, aside from, and it's a recent one that is not indulging into Nordicism, because the author is actually a philologist, a linguist, so it's not even into history or, genetics, all this stuff, that actually parallels Norse literature, Norse sagas, to early Latin poetry, right? And it's easy to find. Now I don't have it, and I don't need to quote it to cite it, because after all, I I don't care to do so. And that expresses the possibility of such influence. After all, we know that there was an influence also in the Germanic world from Italy, right? The Etruscans, their script, etc. Why not the other way around? Why not some groups that eventually entered Italy and diluted? And so what you see as Italic, in a properly Indo-European sense, may have been simply the product of what was all in the original cauldron from which the Germans, the Celts, the Alains, etc. spread. And this is actually no mystery, because we know that exactly because of human mobility and what occurred with the Indo-European migrations, that this is actually very plausible. I don't know if I have the time now to digress also on other spiritual aspects of this, but probably there will be some of this chance along the video, because during the criticism, because I spotted it. In any case, you can't simply have like saying, well, we find Germanic words into medieval Italian, because we know, of course, that the Germans had migrated in part in the late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, and we understand that that's alone. There is, first of all, not even a complete full demonstration of some of these words, so you lack even there that mechanism. But obviously that was happening at a time in which those languages were not were sufficiently formed and diversified for knowing that as such, right? In the first millennium BC, everything is a bit more complicated to assess, right? Naturally, at the end of the first millennium BC, we're talking, yes, a fully formed Latin literature and beyond, so that's another story. But in the moment of the Italic migrations, of those would have become the Italics, well, that's not quite a thing. It's just like with the term Latin, right? We know that these were Indo-Europeans that took the name from the place where they lived, and surely initially they maintained their own name, whichever it was, right? But simply it's gone lost. So why could have not been lost, even if there had been some guy, I don't know, from Central Europe, from eventually those who have fully developed as the Germanic branch of the Indo-European peoples that had this influence on that? I think it's very reductive, and I think that, as we'll see in this video, there is a sort of sharp divide between sort of the Mediterranean dimension and the sort of northern one. And there is no doubt, yes, that carded ware culture is just a bit of a world on its own. You can divide this macroscopic areas, but there is, first of all, it's an incredibly complicated issue, also as far as to which degree did the Indo-Europeans mix ethnically, what is the cultural impact that they had here and there. There are very interesting things we saw, for example, about the religion of the Celts that shows that not necessarily being more genetically Indo-European in ancestry means a greater survival of actual Indo-European values. And I think that Rome, in many ways, right, if you at least consider Dumezil and all respectable names, right, still dated, but surely making a hell of a work that, of course, it's incomparable to anything you see on YouTube, for sure, and that is still studied, academies, well, I think are a bit difficult to simply bypass, right? So while it is true that Indo-European values were largely shared, we've seen it in other, say, in videos of history of religions by other populations, such as, the Egyptians, such as Semitic peoples, to some degree, right, in different degrees, that eventually generated also that hatred, of the racialistic hatred, categorism in the 19th century, etc. But this is exactly the point. Trying to distinguish too much is dangerous in itself, right? It's not a good way, in my opinion, to approach the topic just per se. And so this point of, we don't have Germanic stuff in early Rome. Well, why should it have been, right? It's already complicated to actually look at the very origins of that history notoriously. So why should we even bother ourselves with such notoriously underdocumented or even undocumented dimension? In any case, the Metatron goes on and says, so having established all this, what is the integer that would correctly reflect the presence of Nordic types within the Roman population and specifically within the Roman elites? One step at a time. So yes, this is the idea that I hinted at, that essentially a bit like in early medieval Europe, and I can surely testify for that, there was definitely a and later on, this is true for the Ancien regime at large, still before, in fact, the masses emerged, just like in the same century in which racism was emerging, by the way, interestingly enough. And this is not to say that there wasn't ethnic discrimination in the ancient world. This is also one of the and the Metatron, I think, fought bravely against the same concept. So I know what it means, but I think he was too mild, because actually the ethnic discriminations were brutal in the ancient world, and this aspect is somehow absconditus in a sense, absconditum at least in this, well, we will perhaps make another video about this. And the idea would be that the original clans of the Indo-Europeans that moved into Italy would have somehow been able to maintain their own identity as conquerors and sort of also different genetic pool from the rest of the people, and especially the lower ones, that would have looked different because they came from different places, and especially the Indo-Europeans were particularly selected, mostly from a also man-to-man basis. I mean, these were warlike cultures, were incredibly violent, incredibly, in fact, cut down. It's not even just the weather, like people say, oh, Northern Europeans are just, I don't know, taller because of the weather. Well, that may have helped, but believe me, humans know how to select themselves in ways that, you should ask all the various branches of, early man that were literally taken out from the face of the earth to know that. So it's not really strange at all, right? Now, this aspect, I actually agree with the Metatron on. I do think that actually the Roman elites, by the time, say, of the Principate, were largely indistinguishable from the rest of the Romano-Italic population, phenotypically, genotypically. I think that there was, however, because they had mixed, right, with after like literally a millennium of history, so you cannot quite expect with the political and social means of the time, just to preserve that. But the ideal, right, of the heavenly, virile, Apollonian conquerors of the Mediterranean had been cherished, as we will see many passages, even from the Aeneid, from many sort of self-celebratory works of the Roman elite, the Roman establishment, especially at the time of the empire, etc., were making substantial reference in agreement with something that you see even, I don't know, why the Botticelli represent all white people, right? Very blonde, blue-eyed people, because, Italians at this time were like that. Even if there is a religious reason, it's the universal concept, right, of the fairness equating light, equating spirit, and these people striving to reach that, and of course having some forms of ethnic discrimination that are notorious in everybody who knows Latin literature. Is plenty of. I mean, just think about Horace saying literally, "Roman, beware of dark people," but we'll quote others here, and that were of course connected also with that sort of cultural nostalgia, sort of good savage mythology, etc., that the Romans, especially, very differently from the Greeks that had undergone a process of much greater secularization and rationalization at Rome at some point, in fact, sort of smiled at, even when actually looking at this barbarian, saying, look at how we are superior to them, and what can, in fact, spirit do over matter, because this was the point the Romans had in their mind. Think of the Germans, think of the Celts. This is actually a broader, here I even divided the Greek and the Roman thing, but also the Greeks themselves are a bit like that. There is really a lot, even recently, about Celtic warfare that discusses how the Celts are underestimated in the early times in degree of sort of cultic militarism that eventually the Germans, for reasons that are pertain mostly from the later centuries of our history, re-emphasized in a more consistent fashion, and that were just more present because the Celts somehow were overrun by both the Romans and the Germans, right? But also the degree of documentation, the type of history that was written at different times. And so the diachrony of this is just like, you can't quite pick one guy, as we will see now it's being done. say, living in Cyprus in the later, let's say, the 2nd century AD, and pretending that is actually something speaking of the origins of the Romans and of the Romano-Italic peoples that truly ruled over the rest of the world as a people, right? And of which they were pretty aware in many ways. Of course, with approximations and regarding this identity, even certain forcings, the elimination of part of, for example, the Celtic legacy in northern Italy, etc. But still, bearing in mind that the cultural homogeneity of these people was quite strong by some degree. It's something we find even in the early Middle Ages, right? We don't have any evidence of the Germans calling themselves Germans until the 6th century, right? And that was essentially a Roman ethnic category, right? But later on, right, the same Germans would remember that aside from even the different ethnogenesis of the various confederacies, say, the Goths are an importantly different thing from the Franks, etc., they still nurtured and developed a set of values that you can see in that sort of chivalry. That was also, in fact, an Indo-European thing, so you can't quite distinguish it from even what the Romans had, or even other peoples outside of Europe had. And so that it's incredibly difficult to simply draw a line, right, in between. So the Metatron continues, says, although on this video we are specifically focusing on the claims concerning the ancient Romans, I'd like to spend a word or two to frame our discussion when it comes to what Nordicism is and what is claimed. Nordicism as a school of thought was born between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, with several cultural circles in Europe and America having among its many proponents the American Madison Grant, the Frenchman de Gobineau, and the German Eugen Fischer. According to this ideology, the Nordic phenotypes were culturally and intellectually superior to all other phenotypic variants within the human race. The Nordic type being superior also meant that all other lesser racial groups couldn't and wouldn't have achieved anything parallel within history. When it comes to civilization, building, culture, warfare, linguistics, architecture, inventions, you name it. And therefore, in the wake of this hypothesis, the Roman Empire becomes a problem, you see, because how can a Southern European empire be capable of such grandeur and splendor if they were lesser beings? Specifically, Günther, in his Rassenkunde Europas, which is normally translated in English as the racial elements of European history, attributes the creative force of history to the Nordic element within the fabric of the human race. So here it is correct as a whole. And remember what we said before regarding the fact that at this point it was believed that the origins of essentially the whitest people was Northern Europe itself, right? The Kurganic thing was not come around yet, and so on. So they would be aware, actually, of all the cultural interconnections that had existed during the migrations, etc. But they would simply on the map steer them compared to what we accept largely today from Northern Europe. Regarding this, I would like to point out that as sort of discreditable as it may sound, there are some theories that do actually point at the northern, even Western Sea, etc. This is something that we will read from in other videos from different sources, also from non-Indo-European peoples, etc. You have it even in the foundation of Egypt and so on. So that's something that later on idealistic, even fascistic mystics sort of grapple themselves to, etc. And as fringe as it is, it cannot quite simply be even put aside here. The Metatron doesn't, of course, refer to these, if not marginally, and at least doesn't specifically indicate this point. And yes, there were Nordicists as well, in a way, because they hadn't quite gotten into the sort of Kurganic stuff. But it's when we look at those times and places, it's also shrouded in mystery that I think it's important to say we cannot simply, at least this is how I approach the thing, right? I also was fooled by Nordicistic ideas when I was very young. I thought, yes, that it's from everybody who was blonde, blue-eyed, came from Northern Europe, right? Then I became aware of organic theory. Then I wanted to say, yeah, okay, but what do we actually know? And when you dig into the historiography, you see that, yeah, there are certain patterns that we can match, but over incredibly, say, on the basis of factors that have an incredible range of uncertainty that do not quite make us completely sure what the hell even happened at the time, right? So this is notorious for whoever has studied the field, and even though we live in essentially still structuralistically and left-leaning dominated academy that has completely rejected and basically cancelled and removed this idealistic history together with all the sort of Nordicism that came from it, there's surely a middle ground that deserves to be reappreciated, right? So it's not merely, the Metatron doesn't address this thing at all in the video, but I understand why, because it would also be, it's not much that it would be against his point, and I'm not accusing him of doing this, but let's say it's a big deal, right? And that's also why I'm making this video, because it's not really easily dismissible, I think, or simply demonstrable either, right? So the Metatron goes on and says, and within a picture that tries to claim ethnic appropriation of all the winners, of course the Romans would be included, to claim Nordic cultural markers for the purpose of establishing uniquely superior subgenre of humans, the Roman Empire had to become Nordic, right? So, okay, let's go on. It says, and it didn't end there. According to Günther, all of the following Italic peoples would belong to the Nordic types as well. I'm not aware what Günther specifically said this, but I think it's unlikely that the extent, let's say, that he would actually believe entirely that, I don't know, all the Italic branch was fully Nordic and actually substantiating it with any kind of practical evidence. If he did, yeah, it's foolish. There is no evidence whatsoever for it, but I would also like to know better this guy's work to, like, fully appreciate, and even just in pop culture, like, how much of what derives eventually from this general idea of Nordic influence, or even just Aryan influence in the foundation of Rome and in the Indo-European migrations, actually stems from the belief that simply every single, Italic was actually coming from the Nordic world, and also how it intertwines, by the way, with the sort of Aryan concept later on, because at some point again, these are pretty old authors, things changed even in those circles and wanted to stress something else. But in any case, Nordicism was to be seen as an organic extension of the growing vision of Aryan superiority and constructed vision of caste, which went beyond the social into the genetic heritage, something you couldn't escape from. And overall, it is correct. Like in the 19th century, they were essentially measuring peoples by scale of, say, a very rigid hierarchical accomplishment in the history of civilization. And it was the age of positivism, so much of that came with the sense of how much industrialized we are. It is true that there was actually some sort of positivistic affirmation of imperial power in the ancient world as well. I don't have time to digress on this, so the more powerful you are, the superior you are. This is something that the same Romans actually did believe fiercely, right? The point is that at the time, they were fixating rather on the strict racialistic, and so especially phenotypistic and genetistic categorism. So as the Metatron correctly points out, like, the Italians were too dark for, say, the model of, British or North American white supremacists, and believe me, there was a much more ferocious racism in that world than in places like Germany. Like, Hitler was notoriously inspired by, in his specific racialistic ideologies, by North American theorists. But in any case, the sense was, yeah, we are the most advanced ever, so we're the coolest. So in order to explain why why the Roman Empire existed, and now the Italians are sort of backwards, we have to throw around, this is what now the Metatron explains as well, the fact that they were mixed heavily. Say the Saracens arrived, they raped everyone, and so the majority of Italians are sort of dark, and so it's not just like the pure people of Northern Europe, etc. Right? The Metatron says that is because any forms of supremacy, regardless of what color they are, based on unfairly placed people within very specific societal units of control before they are even born. Yes, which is something that it wasn't actually believed by the ancients, because the ancients believed that you could transfigure bodily on the base of your moral accomplishment, and so that the body is the product of the fall, rather, and so in order to come back, you would pass from dark to white, right? This is basically what the entire Indo-European mythology is founded on, and the same. I never heard the Metatron actually discussing these topics, or but I don't know how actually versed he is, right? It sounds brutal as an explanation, but it is technically what it is. It's not just among the Indo-Europeans, but famously enough, right? There are lots of studies about the mere physical monstrosity. You know, if you look at Germanic, even think about the Aesir against, the monsters, just like the Olympians against the Titans, and so on. And the correspondence with whiteness, fairness, blue eyes, etc. There are plenty of studies regarding that, looking at what, especially Greece, that had more time to sort of blend things together compared to Rome, that literally skyrocketed from a day to another. As far as the empire was concerned, it's also as far as these identities were concerned, and in that sense of transfigurational race. Right, the idea that the world had to be rejuvenated in the golden era through the Roman domination, and this, of course, was about look at Apollo Palatinus, right, in just connected to Augustus' house, right, and what he looked like, and what the entire Renaissance, the entire classicism, is fundamentally about in terms of physical types. This may be uncomfortable to realize if you come from a background, I'm talking generically here, that for which you have been told, well, it was all racial mixing and whatnot. It is not, right? And the interesting thing is that throughout all the ancient regime, this was common knowledge, right? The entire neoclassical thing is not a mere reimitation of the Romans or the Greeks in a aesthetical sense. There's a radically and deeply founded moral doctrine behind that in terms of world domination and imperial values, and the nobility also of blood was so important to them. So the ancients did actually believe in thinking in those terms, but they were also appreciating the transfigurational value of the spirit over matter. And so a Roman wouldn't feel challenged actually by his darkness, as long as he could emerge superior on another group, if any, because the Romans, as we will see, they actually did see themselves partly as fairer than other peoples, and the exception were the barbarians of the north that were, however, assimilated conveniently to the Titans, right? Big but stupid, right? And this is the same concept actually in the same Norse religion and tradition, right? The heroes are actually tiny compared to the monsters. Right, those are really stronger and bigger. They're the great monsters of the pre-Indo-European world coming from the earth, the deterministic, materialistic dimension. Big but stupid, right? Instead, the conquerors were those who really had managed to outsmart them, to conquer lands that were more developed than their own, just because they were more mentally trained as warriors, etc. And this is what they universally had ingrained within them, to different degrees of sort of awareness of the ultimate Apollonian sublimation of it, right? There is a much greater degree, for example, of Dionysian in some Celto-Germanic realities, also because it was needed to achieve the Apollonian transfiguration, the divine one, but that was also based on the sort of confidence that you had in the possibility of winning death, and so transfiguring the world and beyond. Again, this is mostly my thing, because that's what I talk about on YouTube more frequently, but it's important to stress because I don't think the Metatron has ever discussed it, and so this video is partly my opinion for, again, the moderate debunking. It's neither a white nor black supremacism. It's something in between, and so we can all be cool about that. Well, unfortunately, history is a bit more challenging than this. And yes, there was a sort of Roman racialistic celebration of fairness, right? And this is something we will partly address now. So the Metatron says, hence the ancient Romans' claim is methodological part of this structure was also to justify colonial operation in Africa. We're still talking about the 19th century, right? Asia and America, and to the same time to legitimize the rise of northwestern countries in Europe. So first of all, I don't have personally, so that everybody knows, and I always say things, I'm not hiding anything, that I don't find anything wrong with the concept of a people actually succeeding, and only so, in subduing another. Because if that happened, there is a moral discriminant that cannot be ignored, right? So this is not to say that, say, colonialism failed at some point, but initially succeeded, and there is a reason for that, and it's not as simple to equate, okay, these motherfuckers were racist, and were also colonialists, so let's all make them burn in hell, right? Those were also people who built our own world, and that were actually some of the most still morally advanced peoples compared to the others that were at some point also exterminating and enslaving, that weren't anything better in terms of systematic rape, incest, enslavement, massacre. So actually, yes, I do believe in the moral superiority of Western civilization, and I understand how, say, this system exhausted itself because these, especially the racialists and those who were essentially betraying the traditional principle of spiritual development and transfigurational capacity, were trying instead to categorize simply, okay, there are these races, this is inferior, it must be taken out. Whereas the divine spark in the human was actually a founding principle of the same Roman capacity to win over the world. Right, because if they hadn't been capable of that, they would have not been. This was an Alexandrian model as well. They would have not been recognized for their own intrinsic superiority ipso facto, and this was a problem, right? So, of course, the 19th century racialists didn't care about this. There was a lot of also sort of cultural complex of inferiority that spread black legends about the Southern Europeans that, in fact, depicted them still today in a much darker and even just phenotypically way that they actually are, and we'll talk about it in the end, because I don't think that most adults in the West, let's not even talk about the rest of the world, but actually have a substantial idea of what actual genetics, anthropometric, etc., even the major Western European country, Italy in this case, actually is, and especially if we're not talking about historical awareness. So it's a total disaster. But let's say one should be able to see beyond, say, the negative aspects that emerge from this, and trying to understand what they thought at the time, both in the 19th century and, say, at the time of Caesar, right? In any case, the Metatron goes on, says, coming from the north as invaders, these Nordic types, so talking about the proto-Italics, they would have allegedly forced themselves and superimposed themselves on the local populations with a dominant role, creating a supposed ethnic separation between the upper class or the ruling elite of more pure Nordic blood and the ruled belonging to a different ethnic subcluster. Now, as hideous as some people may think it is, this is what in part did actually happen, right? This is not to say that even from the first generations, it wasn't an extensive merging and intermarriage, etc. But this is something that we easily find, even during the Middle Ages. There are certain things that even the Metatron quotes here, that the sites that are actually saying the same. That there were people that wanted to look in a certain way, for example, because they attributed certain value. This is at least typical in the Middle Ages. You know that, I don't know, it was common even in Southern Europe, if you think Mathilde of Knoss, etc., to erode literally their own faces with chalk, which is what the same darker Roman women did, as the Metatron quotes there, to be whiter, etc., because there was something about the fact that the Germans had taken over, that a lot of the nobility was actually that ethnically separated by a degree, right? Not that they wouldn't marry into the local nobility as well, but hey, those guys had arrived, had actually occupied the places of power, they had their own retinues, their own clans. It's not as simple as saying, we have to dismiss it, because this never happened. This wouldn't even explain why this minority managed to impose their own language, for example, and their own values, which is something actually consensual, right? Throughout all these conquests in history, if the rulers could rule, it's because they had the moral support, the decisive moral support of the population, as subjects as well. And the ancients were not tender-hearted. There was a fierce, brutal sense. Think about the Vedic cases and so on. The same with Roman slavery, etc. There was a truly biological sense that those who were at the top were superior and those who were at the bottom were inferior, right? Because they had failed morally to transcend. True self-sacrifice in holy combat, which is essentially what these cultures were all about, and that the Romans maintained fiercely, as in their taste for duels, for head severing, etc. All things that actually the same Celts did, also the same Germans did. And yes, it's not a myth that Celts did do that, together with human sacrifice, etc. And the fact that, say, you cannot explicitly connect it for this polyomia, because there is no source that explicitly tells that, doesn't mean anything. We know how anthropology works. This was completely normal, and the fact that it's not explicitated, and that there was some sort of puritanic attitude on the basis of, I don't know, a millennium, 2 millennia of history later, doesn't actually have any value, right? Comparative and diachronic history is the most useful one, with all its tricks, all its problems, but it cannot be ignored. Right, we have been told a completely different history of the Roman world from the one that actually was, right? And it is, for what at least we've thought to be the right thing, much darker than we would like to hear. So the Metatron says, if this were true, this would be a very easily demonstrable phenomenon. Not really, as I explained before, right? Would have left clearly identifiable marks within the metrics of the time. Yes, that they spoke Italic, that they spoke an Indo-European language over a people that obviously was largely non-Indo-European, like basically everywhere in Europe, right? Aside from the massacres that did happen at some point. But let's remember that also the most victorious Indo-Europeans and the most successful ones were the ones who conquered places like Greece, right? The Dorians. Why is there actually? You can't even appreciate this from the same mythologies of these peoples and the degree to which they stressed what they were able or were not able to do, right? The Greeks had really thought to have founded the world, right, in Delphi when they had conquered. The Romans sort of had a revolution over time. They had these values coming from this ancestral sort of warlike dimension, partly shared by the same subjects, but they cultivated and revived them. And the system boomed for some reason. And you can't quite explain it mechanistically otherwise, right? But that's the matrix. That's the point. Because we still speak those languages, right? And you do not really take that much of a... And surely, if we're talking just about the North Germanic element, I'm perfectly fine in assessing that there were much more Italics having, say, descending from being culturally, influenced by a Balkan branch rather than a Northern European one. But since it seems that most of these peoples actually came from more or less the same areas from which the Ostrogoths, the Longobards came from, like for entering Italy later on, and surely there were many other Brucklets and absolutely, some Indo-European in Italy, but this happened with the same Celts. It happened with even the ancestors of those who had migrated before and that we have no news of, except when the Celts arrived in Cisalpine Gaul, they said, these guys are like us. And this is documented by the same Romans. So nothing is random. Nothing is, okay, well, the Italics had nothing to do with the Germanic peoples. I mean, they literally sprang from the same culture. So I think there are some words that are basically the same. I will make a video at some point especially about the Roman, Celtic, Germanic military terms. But this is a very founded concept in Indo-Europeistics. Actually, it's the cornerstone of the same discipline, and so I don't understand why this would be such a strange thing. If we extremize saying, well, all the italics were from Sweden, from Scandinavia, I'd say, not to sound too anachronistic, well, yeah, that's evidently not the case. That's not even like, I'd bet everything I have on it. But if we are asking in a broader Indo-European sense, was there a connection between the, say, Romano-Italic elites and some ancestral Indo-European background, at least in a valorial sense, and possibly some degree of phenotypic selection? I'd say absolutely. I don't think there is any doubt about that either. And why shouldn't it be the case? I can't think in this sense of any other, in that case, left-leaning political bias for which it shouldn't be the case. Am I saying that the Metatron has this? No, not necessarily, but I've been through the career, and I know that initially you're prone to think that, and if you do not really get into the core of the matter, you may remain of that idea, so that you would think you're neutral, but you're not realizing that there is something from your own world that suggests that, and not necessarily the craziest sort of openly racist anti-white ideologies that we witness today, but generally a much bigger picture. It was starting literally from the same Nordicists, in a sense, from the nationalist, socialist, and socialist ideologies, because at some point they actually overlap abundantly, of the 19th and 20th century, right, and of masses that had no historical education whatsoever. But let's continue what the Metatron says. Continuing with the hypothesis, many centuries later, after Italy had already established itself first as a republic, well, okay, let's not be so drastic. I hate the term republic. We all know what it is, and first of all, it was the Res Publica Populi Romani, so not literally, say, Italy as a whole, right? It was always an ad personam issue, as you know, and yes, at some point Italy gets all the civitas optimo iure, but let's say it's not Italy, it's Rome, right? This is particularly important because that's how they identified. And then as an empire, and that in fact happened even earlier, at least if we count the foundation of an empire when the Romano-Italic Confederacy established the provinces in the various today's Italian islands, except Corsica, of course, that is French, but it was Italian for a long time too. And so let's see what it says. Instead, the empire constant influx of slaves would have polluted irreparably the Nordic blood of Italy with elements coming from the Levant. Yeah, this is absolutely BS. I totally agree. Yeah, this is not real. But, right, when these Nordicistic authors refer to the Levant specifically, they were referring to specific complaints within the very abundant material on this in Latin literature regarding the typical sort of free man from the Eastern world was a lesser type, according to the Romans, morally. There are racialistic inferences in that, and there was a great sense of malaise that actually looks pretty much like the one that we have today against illegal aliens and everything that concerns the fact that they're basically coming to profit of our moral sort of softening up, right? And because they are hungrier and we stopped, say, thinking about what actually matters. And so this creates a both side problem at the end of the day. But the thing there is pretty famous. It's almost a leitmotif in Roman history, this sort of dynamic, the Levantine sort of, and as we will see now, there is a greater specificity because, as the Metatron points out correctly, there was a lot of anti-Semitism at the time for reasons that were also different necessarily from any meeting that had existed prior to that time between, say, I don't know, the Indo-Europeans and the Semites, or at least it had happened, but not to leave us with sort of ideological bias, right, say, against the Jews, etc., and the terrible Semitic nature of Christianity that is actually just part of the same universal, but I will not digress into this. The Metatron says it is basically a claim of ethnic replacement. As it's often the case with such ideologies, this would have led to the decay of the customs and culture and political collapse of the late empire. Well, it's difficult to say. I can't say I'm an idealist per se, but I'm a Clausewitzian, and I think that moral forces are superior to anything else in relative terms. So I do believe that was a moment of exhaustion of the Roman Empire. I've been also myself very much into the Byzantine world, that I will keep calling Byzantine, even though, of course, there were Romans to an extent, and officially and formally made plenty of videos on this topic, by the way, to explain why we shouldn't be phobic towards certain terminologies if we actually care about history. And not to say that this actually encompassed a bit the entire Mediterranean, but the entire Europe. The migration era was not really a party for anyone. So I do believe that, of course, again, today I don't have really the full time to explain this, but there are massive political, military, and social indicators about something changing for the worse. And they may have been more subtle than the catastrophistic Enlightenment sort of Gibbon type ideas were about, but the concept in itself, right, aside from the extremes, right, the concept in itself, in my opinion, is valid. And I can debate this in another video, even though I have an enormous interest in late antiquity. I love that. I love the late Roman army. I'm part of that club, right? So, but I also sort of grew up at a point and recognized that those ideas that I said, no, it's all BS, right? It's just propaganda. They come back carsically, and they do have some validity that cannot be historically say, okay, well, no, it's not the case. Just because today's scholars at large say it's not, because they want to sort of complicate and relativize things. No, right? There is some to it. And just one has to frame it correctly, not like these guys did, for sure. The Metatron says, now that we understand the basis of this thesis, let's examine it in details to see if it can be substantiated with evidence. The thesis itself is, academically speaking, extremely weak. Well, of course, if you extremize the concept of the italics were literally Scandinavian peoples, yes, all right. The first main problem appears when we start to examine the phenotypic variety of those very slaves that are considered to be the problem in the first place, right? So here it's actually talking about the ethnic replacement that would have made the Italians non-Nordic Romans anymore. First of all, this idea that many, if not the majority of slaves that would be brought into Rome were of Levantine origin is absolutely absurd. And just for clarity's sake, when Günther says Levantine, he means Semitic. I don't know whether Günther was specifically referring to that. He could have probably even, surely he didn't have sympathetic ideas towards the Camites as well, but yeah. Rather, say, Africans, for example. But it's not unfair to say, actually, if you look at the composition of the early Imperial Roman army, that together with the Gauls, that actually the Metatron here explains to us correctly, were a major component in the Roman army. Were also lots of Syrians, specifically, a lot of people coming from the Levant. So, and again, in Roman literature, we do see those people, especially in Rome, right? This doesn't mean, indeed, as genetic studies prove, that there was an ethnic replacement of the Romano-Italic population. It's absolutely false. I absolutely agree with the Metatron. But that's exactly the point. The impression is that he's exceeding from the other side in order to depict these ideas as completely unfounded by idiots that didn't know what they were talking about, while actually these people were also going by degree, even when they were making a mistake, which is worth mentioning. Because, of course, talking about these authors is important as well, is interesting as well, just for the sake of history. Now, during, he says, the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, the first to trade in slaves with Rome is Cisalpine Gaul, so the Celtic word according to Cassius Dio. The boy and the rest of the Gauls offered in sale various articles and particularly high number of slaves. Right. Well, yes, this is not a surprise, right? But yeah, it's also obvious the Romans had Celts or Celticized peoples within the same northern and even parts of central Italy. So I don't have to teach this to the Metatron that knows this. I mean, I'm really amicable in here, but yeah, how does this help? Actually, it's a parenthesis that, yes, I understand it's to debunk the Levantine stuff, but there was a presence of that. I actually know there are substantial communities of, say, I don't know, Jews in late Roman Gaul, for example, pretty large ones, right? Also in southern Italy, this is notorious, right? If you have studied late antiquity, early Middle Ages, that's quite the case. They were mostly urban. The wide majority of the people inhabited in the countryside, and that's why these were not so relevant, right? In the broader sort of regional picture of the local genes, but there was a sense that at least they're in the places where people wrote and were sort of more likely to make us to have their work survive, for us to find. There was a noticeable presence of also if these people could move simply, right? They weren't just poor people, but they were actually educated people. This is also how the Roman administration, politics worked through, remuneration and merit. So I don't have to talk with the Metatron that has talked about this, and we know what we're talking about, I think. The Roman military campaigns, he says, against the Hellenistic kingdoms, against Carthage and Iberia, surely brought into Rome a very diverse influx of all sorts of ethnicities, as slaves, Greeks, Iberics, Illyrians, Syrians. But the wars between the Romans and the Gauls in both Cisalpine Gaul and Gallian Arbonenses brought into Rome Celtic slaves, therefore Nordic, if you will. Now, I do have a big problem with this definition, for the simple fact that doesn't matter how, say, reddish and blondish haired the Romans and the Greeks depicted the Celts, I doubt, to say the least, that you can actually look at the Celtic world as a whole and saying these are Nordic types. They aren't, right? The wide majority of these people did not look a Nordic or a typical sort of fully blonde hair blood. No, there is no evidence of this whatsoever. And the fact that, because sadly, the Metatron, I don't know what is with this video, because I know he made much better points in other videos than this. I don't know whether, he didn't consider the fool. He wanted to do it easily, but it's kind of obvious, right? This is notorious. You can't quite say, if the Romans said this at some point, it means that to them those were sort of Nordic, right? That may have been a stereotype that he uses that actually to prove that the Romans did not identify as them. That's a fair point. We will see it now, but what does that mean in practice is different. So here the Metatron is literally saying, if you will, Roman, Celtic slaves were Nordic? No, right? The majority of the peoples inhabiting the enormous Celtic world were surely dark-haired, right? At least dark in a sort of, they were not blonde or red-haired, right? I don't think there is any evidence whatsoever, ethnogenetically, anthropometrically, whatever. Some, if you look at the war bands, if you look even at the elites, this is the interesting point, because we are much more likely to find the remains of the elites preserved for our DNA inquiry to work, and it is possible, actually, as I do believe that there was this sort of even racially based sort of bias towards, again, the whiter, the bigger you were, the sort of more noble in theory you could be, because as a warrior in those societies, that's how you could concretely even be more powerful. And this also is a wild approximation, because most of these peoples were farmers at the end of the day. They would fight when necessary, but just as levies, right, and not as knights, even though there was a proto-feudal dimension in the Celtic world, but absolutely not, right? Aside from what, and we will pass to this, the Greek-Roman sources say about the Gauls as a stereotype, right? These people were not, by the majority, Nordic, right? If there was anything in the ancient world approximating to that, it was definitely, yes, the North Germanic area, and just approximating it because it was full of Germans with dark hair, just like there are today in Scandinavia. And part of the steppe, even though the concept is slightly more complicated, but not. I think that there, especially before the Turkic migrations, things were perhaps much more. Look at the Tocharians, if you look at how they represented themselves. I made a video specifically about them, or also looking at their onomastics and obvious symbology there and self-representation, and things are very, 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 very interesting. That's why you can find in Afghanistan, just among pretty dark people, like a person that is, easily looks Scandinavian in the stereotypical sense. It's no mystery. We all know it. Again, nothing to be. We know how those areas were populated by historical, so it's really normal. The Metatron goes on and says these Gallic slaves would not have been numerically insignificant. In fact, they made their own cohesive unit during Spartacus' rebellion, as we all know. But yes, again, it would have been simpler if you had said that, 1/3 of Italy was Celtic or Celticized, right? Those became fully Italian Romans. So, between the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Principate in the Imperial Age, the main Roman military campaigns will take place in Gallia first with Julius Caesar, then in Britannia with Claudius, on the Alpine Arc, including various conflicts on the east of the Rhine and Danube borders. And yes, these were all correctly, essentially, either Celtic or Celticized areas. And whatever that means, by the way, because this doesn't even start to take into consideration what relation existed actually between those peoples and, say, the Indo-Europeans that had migrated there and the pre-existing peoples, right? So just saying, but the Romans thought, or the Greeks thought that the Gauls were all like blonde or red hair. Well, who cares, right? You can easily see it's not a thing. But in any case, by the application of very simple logics, the Metatron says, we can see that the result when it comes to influx of slaves coming from all different campaigns within the Celtic world would have brought a high number of Nordic types. In fact, I must confess, I must give him a thing here. Here, I think I don't have the video here, I have just the transcript, but I watched the video, and that's where he says Nordic, making sort of brackets with his fingers, right? So the Metatron knows this, so I don't understand why also slip, because again, if you watch, I'm just commenting on the transcript, right? But if you're an average person watching this video the first time, you hear this thing thrown around in a relatively quick way. Again, it's a short video given the topic, so given that you must make some compromise, but we must be careful about this. So here is also making the point that technically the slaves would have not been however fairer than the average Romano-Italic people, more looking like, say, definitely not being elite, right? This is true, except if we consider that the various elites of the empire eventually came from the same places where these slaves were eventually taken from. In part, they came from abroad, further, across the frontier. But in practice, we must think that if there was a selection of that kind, preferring, for example, think about the Belgians saying we prefer to consider ourselves Germans than Gauls because the Gauls are to soften up and whatever. But there would have been that sense of maybe if we look more like those hawkish conquerors, we will really be better. And they cared about sort of the ethnic refinement there. So also the Gallo-Roman elites would have, according to this racialistic idea, been slightly fairer than the average Gaul, right? This is just an hypothesis to give you that, but I think it's extremely likely because it's the same thing that happened in other times. These were whiter conquerors of darker peoples. In the Middle Ages we find this. In the ancient world we do find this. And I don't think it's that strange at all, right? Because it's not about the race itself, it's all what comes together with it, right? And so there is an element of randomness if you do not want to believe in racialistic theories. But you can't quite even distinguish race from values. And again, just the fact that all these peoples that were definitely not all, or by the majority Nordic, still spoke languages that came from, again, the Aryan cauldron, I think tells us something, right? And we will explain this further. The Metatron says, data also confirms that the impact slaves had on the original genetic pool of Italia is most likely negligible and would need to be substantiated by evidence, which is obviously missing because it's nonsense. Well, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say it's nonsense, right? There are plenty of, again, I think legitimate studies that tell us that we're pretty sizable communities of Easterners in some places in Italy. Again, it's not negligible because it's nonsense. It's negligible because it's numerically negligible, right? But not because it's nonsense, right? So I don't like the slip either. Then, where is the empiric evidence that would supposedly counter the instead established fact that the Celts were the enemies, not the Roman elites? Inconsequential, right? So this is also something like, it's obvious that the Roman elite there would have been regulated socially in ways that would recognize that even if somebody was fairer, could be a slave, because they truly believed that you could fall, right? They looked at how the concrete manifestation of the imperium on earth, right? And it was a constant struggle against the forces of evil. So you can have all the same strange, the same Romanization of these peoples. The fact that the Celts, the more warlike populations, were co-opted and Romanized successfully. I mean, Gaul being surely the best example of Romanization outside of Italy, had a lot of sort of connections, not with the racial element, but with the fact that at the end of the day, the Romans were well disposed towards such peoples, and they had all the, say, in a sense, look at Caesar's effort to show the Roman elite, of course, that the Gauls were ready for Romanization. This is what I mean. Of course, he could massacre a whole load of them for quite pragmatic political contingencies, but the idea is that these peoples were not felt as, oh my god, this sucks really, so we shouldn't even mix ourselves with them. That's not how ancient peoples reasoned, especially the most successful ones, right? The Greeks got overrun because they didn't really want to extend their citizenship to other barbarians, right? And they had close mentally, rather than appreciating that somebody was strong enough to rule, they would rule. And the Romans gave a redemptional chance that it was, at the end of the day, the divine transfiguration was in conferring the imperium through citizenry, and so the possibility of joining the military to these very populations by making them fight together with them as auxiliaries. So again, this is not exactly, it's a bit of a spiral of cut short consideration. The Metatron goes on, says, there is absolutely no reason to believe that the Roman elite was homogeneously constituted by Nordic types. Absolutely, yes. But there is also no reason to believe that the Roman elite was not homogeneously constituted by any kind of phenotypic criteria, right, among the others, because how do you demonstrate, like, you can't say it even for today's world, right, because of personal preferences and more. The Metatron says, on the contrary, within Roman society and the perspective of the people, we see a very specific reaction towards the traits of the northern people, which place them clearly in the category of extravagant, exotic, foreign, right? Now, this is true if you pick, again, the most obvious realization that of course, the Romans did talk about these Celto-Germanic peoples in sort of, oh, look, these are the barbarians, they look different, they behave different, so they're a bit all weird, and so we associate the fact of being blonde-haired, red-haired, to this sort of, oh my god, they're not like us, they're so different for many reasons, including that one. But this does not resolve, as we will see now, there is all a list of these famous passages, some famous, some less famous, but there are some things to debunk here. Metatron says, moreover, if there were the case, the existence of a degree of secondary diagnosis in the social linguistical context of Rome would have been observed with the upper class speaking a form of Germanic language, while the people would have to be speaking Latin kind of similarly how to in 1066 during the establishment of the Duchy of Normandy in England. Here I don't know the transcript what said. Well, okay, we know what we're talking about. The Duchy of Normandy conquers England, while and so they were speaking Western Frankish, while the Anglo-Saxons spoke their own Germanic language, but the elites, the Normans, kept speaking French, which gave birth to the very mixed Germanic and Romance language that we today call English. Well, aside from the fact that English is still de facto Germanic language, but aside from that, how do you explain that pre-Indo-European Italy began to speak Indo-European after the Indo-European conquest? Right? This is also not just 1066. Where's the evidence? Well, again, we're talking about the turn of the second millennium BC into the first one. It's such a far time before. I made before the example of the Longobards. The Longobards began to legislate and to speak what? Romance, right? And there is an important discriminant there, also regarding the social stratification. Like the English, the Anglo-Norman kings kept speaking French, not just because for a long time they had French possessions and they had stemmed from there and they were of that stock, but because their feudal hierarchy placed them far above what the Anglo-Saxons at some point could do, even though of course they were married into one another. And you easily see how, for example, the Longobards didn't, the Franks, for example, speak German. Say at least in France, what would become France, the local kings did speak, in fact, a Romance language, only definitely from the 10th century onwards. As Germanic had been maintained. You cannot look at the turn of the second and first millennium BC and say, look, this guy's, we should find Germanic evidence, because that Germanic language did not quite exist. It was the same Indo-European Italic language that eventually was declined for us to be documented much later, when there are lots of in common basic Indo-European words, like in etymology, slightly varied, that were used by the same Germans that, Tiberius found on the Elbe while conquering Germany later on. So the interesting thing here is that it seems to me there is a sort of push for saying this is impossible. There is no Germanness whatsoever. Sometimes we don't even know what was the actual origin of some peoples that we find around the Mediterranean. Even in those cases, yes, they were likely not of Germanic or Nordic origin whatsoever. I don't want to defend that point, but again, how can you demonstrate that the opposite is not true? Like, how do you know? Because even during the migration era, we find people that were easily traveling far and wide from northern to southern Europe, and yes, it was a sort of more advanced world, more interconnected one, but let's not exaggerate. Human mobility is that easy. Was there ever in the first millennium BC a Germanic chieftain or Proto-Germanic chieftain that established itself in Italy? Easily, yes. Right? I can tell you that it existed, even though we don't have any documented proof of that. Why? Because it's so obviously possible, right? Not to make any substantial impact, because rightfully also the language surely doesn't show us this degree of Germanization. But I don't think that the Nordicists were actually referring to that. I think that the Nordicists were referring to that because they were still believing that the Aryans had originated in Northern Europe, and they were thinking that consequently any other sort of dynasty, stock, whatever, that had invaded these other places to spread from this Indo-European motherland of Scandinavia that they thought it was, and so speaking an Indo-European language in the south of Europe would have matched the thing, right? But it's not that they literally ever thought that, say, all the Oskans were coming from Scandinavia. This is not the point, right? I know that, in fact, it's much more complicated than what the Nordicists were saying, but it doesn't quite turn down the possibility that, yes, why not, right? Why isn't it possible that the Latino-Faliscans maybe had something in common with more Central and Northern Europe than, say, Eastern Europe or the Balkans? as the routes of invasion, say. Why not? Right? We cannot demonstrate it fair, but couldn't it be possible? We're talking about very early in time, 1200 BC. What the hell do we don't know anything. I mean, Roman history basically starts, like, in a truly documentary sense, at least with the full development of a Latin literature in the 3rd century BC. Of course, we have plenty of Roman, say, Latin script before, etc. But let's be honest, even historiographically, what happens before 270 BC, it's myth mixed with history. It's something that we must understand in an anthropological sense through the sagas and what the Romans believed of themselves. And the system of values were pretty similar, by the way, to the ones of the other Indo-European peoples. And it's not that the Celto-Germanic word was that distant historically for saying, well, you would just have to have Caesar invading Gaul to discover, oh my god, there are the Gauls now, even the Transalpine ones, aside from the ones that existed in Italy, or the Germans. Of course, they knew about one another. It's just that they wouldn't write excessively or communicate in ways that we can easily document. But it's absolutely possible that there were Nordic elements, even in the foundation of some ancient Italian communities at a point. And we see it also in the Middle Ages from the migration era, and it wasn't easier before, especially without writing. These people began to speak an Indo-European language. It's crazy if you think about that. Whatever happened from a moral point of view, of course, must be forcefully considered from a historical point of view as well, because that's literally the microscopic evidence that we have, and that must be framed. I think it's the big elephant in the room here. Not for supporting the Nordicists specifically, but for assessing what were sort of the broader cultural roots of literally the very language that these people spoke, and that everybody spoke among the Italics, right? Not the Italians. The distinction there, of course, the Metatron knows what I'm talking about. The Etruscans didn't speak. There is a debate about that, but let's say, the Celts did not speak Italian, right? Even though basically the Gallic declension is identical to the second Latin one, but this is exactly the point I'm making. They were basically the same people to some degree of dilution, right? And that's what I stress all the time, that we are very often entrapped by sort of the written, like I'm a great fan of Roman literature. I'm not absolutely one of those guys that has, the Romans were just writing propaganda. Yes, they were writing in a way that you do not understand, right? But in that sense, again, if I say Celt or German, what does that even mean exactly? Because it's not clear at all, especially when you claim that we're all blonde or red-haired in those very tales. It's obviously not true, we know that. Right, but evidently the concept served a specific purpose that we will try to understand better in a while. The Metatron says, well, within the Roman world there is no such thing. If anything, the educated Roman elites wanted to learn to speak Greek and other Mediterranean languages to reflect the social cultural power dynamics of the Mediterranean. Yes, well, in the 4th century BC, a Roman thought that learning how to read and write was being an effeminated, inferior person. Right, so it's obvious that in the somehow Hellenized Roman Mediterranean, where again the Greek was the dominant literary, philosophical, cultural civilization, the educated Romans would obviously look up to the model of Alexander, and that there is some sort of racial bias to it, right? These guys were thought to descend literally from the gods, or better God, because they all dated back to the factor Jupiter. If you look at the ancestry of Caesar, according to his descendants, he came literally with what Aeneas descended from. It was, if you go back in time, it's literally Jupiter himself, it's Zeus, because it comes from the Hellenic reference. But it was obviously a racial concern, and the reason why they were learning Greek was also just practical. You have to run an empire that is based on the Mediterranean after centuries of Hellenic civilization. What you want to learn? Germanic, which is not even a written language. So I don't think this is a point in to say, oh, look, the Romans were learning Greek because they cared so much about, the race of the people who spoke it, or even if they did, because they actually, in fact, were obsessed with color just per se, right? They saw something else. They, after all, had conquered the Greeks, and that the Romans mocked them. They called them the Graeculi, which actually refers to the fact that they were smaller in size to the Romans. And that is surely a racial thing. Rome had also stepped over them as the victorious conqueror, and this thing is something that the Romans were pretty aware of, and so that they styled themselves even as improvers of the same Greek accomplishment to show that they were better than them. So I wouldn't place such, and considering the sort of winking, again, good savage sort of stereotypes that many Roman authors, especially the ones think about Caesar, Tacitus, looking at the Celts, the Germans, etc., they were actually highlighting those same virtues that the Romans were nostalgic of in their own ancestral sense of stock also. So I understand that, again, the video is pretty short. You cannot refer to the fact that it's mostly an early imperial thing, but in early imperial times, as we will see now, the Romans were not quite simply the Romano-Italics anymore, right? And time had passed from the time, the Italics had established themselves. So I don't think that this is a very useful point, very effective one. The Metatron says, we have overwhelming evidence that the Nordic phenotype characterized by very white skin, blonde or red hair, blue or green eyes, extremely white people, is considered by the Romans as something extraneous. Now, I don't like this either, for the simple reason, by the way, that if you look at the section of the video when he talks about that, the Metatron shows the pictures of not just blonde or blue-eyed people, but I don't know, probably the single whitest person that is not common to find even in Scandinavia, almost albino type. And I understand that he wants to make the case that, yes, that doesn't look like, I don't know, Southern European typically. But as we will descend into this, to claim, especially after having remembered that there was no great continuity, say, discontinuity ethnically, in the Italian peninsula from ancient times to today, well, you would know that still in contemporary Italy, it's, blonde, blue-eyed people are all but extraneous or exceptional, or it's actually a very common thing, I would say. Say, not as common, of course, as in Scandinavia, there's no doubt, but it's not like, oh my god, you have to search among so many Italians. I think, like, I don't know, 1/3 of ethnic Italians has sort of fairer, as he said later, light brown hair, and like 1/5 has blue or green eyes. So it's not really like, oh my god, in Roman times, these people should have been so, feel blonde or red-haired people with blue or green eyes, as something, oh my god, extraneous to their culture. Are we kidding or what? I mean, this is a heavily racialistic thing. I know that the Metatron says very often, I'm Italian, so I know what I'm talking about. That's a punchline that I don't like at all, right? First of all, let's stick to the fact that this is just blatantly untrue, just like a statement, in that the fact, as we will see now, that the Romans considered these peoples extraneous doesn't actually tell, is referring, in fact, to the Celts and the Germans. It's not implicitly just saying that an Italic could not be that, right? Telling the truth, Italy, even today, has a pretty substantial amount of red-haired people, differently from example from Central Eastern Europe. The Slavs, for example, are notoriously just blonde, right? If they find red hair there, it's just because there were some Norse mixed with Celts, etc. So, and this reddish hair, it's concentrated in northern Italy and in parts, again, of the Adriatic, the central part where the Senones lived. So, given that we're talking about early imperial times, these were Italian Romans, right? And so it's hardly, and it's full, actually, we will read them now, and I will make even a video about this, of references of Roman reference of their own, of the presence of a blonde character to them, even by the way, with this strange etymological distinction that the Metatron makes, saying that Flavus was actually not referred just for the barbarians, absolutely false. There are pretty famous passages. I will quote them later that refer not just to Roman heroes, but literally to the Italic peoples, to the Latins as a whole, more specifically, that actually use that adjective to actually say that that's what they were, and exactly in those archaic times. So how is that? Right. So let's not invent this. I know perfectly central, southern Italians that are blonde, blue-eyed, you know what, complained to me that some uneducated Italians thought, because of racial stereotypes, that they were not Italian. They must have had foreign ancestry. I've met plenty of foreigners that literally think that Italians look like just dark hair and dark eyes, and that they're surprised when I say that, oh my god, but really, you have blonde, blue hair? I've met a lot of people who think like this. So the mere statement that a blonde or red hair, blue-green eyes was something extraneous to the Romans, especially the Italian ones, is a pretty severe and disturbing concept that I think, especially from an Italian like the Metatron, I would have not expected, and especially when the thing is trope, I am Mediterranean, I look like this, you don't talk about my culture. Well, you know, I will keep silence on certain things. So the Metatron says, these to the Romans are the... And by the way, again, it's not that the Celts as a whole had blonde or red hair. Not even the majority of them had. So can't you see that what the Romans said at the time could be easily just a racialistic bias like the many that we have today, for which we would say we were racist nowadays if we said that. But if the Romans said it, it's fine, because so you can make the video validating that, this sort of terrible Nordicists that are, it's full of white supremacists, admittedly, but it's sort of, here the thing is getting in a direction that I don't like at all. So the Metatron says these to the Romans are the characteristics, the markers of the people of the north, the Celts, the Germanic tribes. Vitruvius writes, the races that receive nourishment in the north are characterized by tall stature, fair complexion, hair straight, and reddish blue eyes. So what is the north here? Because even today, people think that in the north, that's how Northern Europeans are in general, right? Like the same people that I was mentioning before. This is, again, pretty strange to me. If I meet a person that says this, to me, it's just a grossly undereducated person. And there is no way I can define this, right? In any case, at the time, they could write a bit whatever they wanted. And yes, if the stereotype like today, oh my god, you're so fair, you look like a Swedish. Yeah, well, it could be, but is it just something we should take seriously because Vitruvius just wrote it? Right, it may be a provocative question, but since I have my dose of evidence that is also a bit more, say, classical in, say, sophistication, and the quotes that I will make later that, are just easily more and easy to find really than what Metatron did here, and it's not that sayings just per se are that gotcha proof, as he actually says later, which I don't like either. Pliny writes, Metatron says, in the cold areas of the world opposite to those inhabited by the Ethiopians, we have people that have a candida cuta, in candid flesh, a flavis prominentis crinibus, long blonde hair, the contraposition. Fine. This is also pretty generic as well. I mean, you simply say, well, the North and then the Ethiopians, and so, yeah, from an extreme and another, yeah, okay, and then, is this like an ethnogenetic proof of what the Romans thought, and couldn't they be, generally speaking, wrong, right? Did they have our means of anthropometric or phenometric, let's say, inquiry. They knew for certain that these people... I understand that the Metatron is saying this to show, obviously, that, say, no, Romans are not Nordic as a whole. That's perfectly fine, right? But these statements are not just... You take refuge into this as if we were making the point after these statements that you made that I found, again, pretty uncomfortable to listen to. Well, I wouldn't go that far. In any case, he says, between the very white Nordic type and the Ethiopian, he's also found Lucian of Samosata, a very famous rhetor that... let's point this. This is Samosata. It's a city on the Euphrates. So this person definitely was from there in the 2nd century AD, writing in Greek, right? And he says, word in Greek, he used these 3 terms to identify all people. He identified them either as black, white, or blonde. And so Greek and Romans consider themselves not blonde, right? Now, again, for the same reason, what kind of scientific criterion is there in quoting Lucian of Samosata for eventually, as it repeatedly goes on in the video, this would be the sort of punchline saying the Greek and the Romans did not consider themselves blonde, right? As if it was not normal to be blonde because a guy on the Euphrates wrote that, and so that is supposed to... let's say, I'm not saying that the Romans considered themselves blonde, except, as we will see now, some passages are explicit about that. The point is, again, is what Lucian of Samosata says representative of all Roman history, of Romano-Italic peoples, of the origins of the, say, Italic presence in Italy, in the general distribution of, again, red, blonde hair, like in a scientific manner? Does this matter at all? Right? Is this how you think we make history? That's not how we do. All right? As we continue reading the classics, we'll find, he says, more evidence that the Romans perceived the Nordic phenotypic traits with a sense of otherness. For instance, here is how Livy describes the physique of the Gauls. Check this out. He tells us the Gaul is particularly incapable of sustaining heat. This is okay. It's not particularly able sustaining heat. First of all, we should point out that the Romans had a very sort of moral fixation with these physical differences. For them, it was important to say, even that they were shorter and darker than they were, to prove that they could beat those who thought maybe to be better than them at that. They may have been complex even. Except they also did beat them, aside from this. But the idea that the barbarian could not sustain heat, and the Roman could, is also something connected actually with the fact that the Roman could sustain cold as well. That there was a moral superiority that allowed, say, the barbarian that was, as they thought, that races sprang in the north would be habituated to cold, as opposed to, I don't know, somebody living in Africa was habituated to living in heat, right? And the Roman beat them all because he was so strong that he could discipline himself to fight in every situation. Now, we know perfectly well that, I think, even if there were some racial difference regarding to temperature sustainability, this is irrelevant in a true context, right? Especially in battle, as we'll see now, because the Metatron goes on and says, according to Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a battle occurred under the sun in Latium, and he tells us, once again, speaking about the Gauls, as much as sweat pouring out over their whole bodies would not let them either grasp the swords or hold their shields firmly, since their fingers slipped on the handles and no longer kept a firm hold. Now, opologically speaking, this is BS. It's just like saying, the Crusaders from Belgium were not able to conquer Jerusalem because, they sweat too much for some reason. Of course, I'm not saying that Metatron believes this. I hope he doesn't, really. But here it's not even it's a racial reference, but it's not a phenotypic reference. It just says that the Gauls were, yes, sort of different from the Romans, but I mean, the Gauls were, again, this sort of stereotype, and plus this is an episode that happened in Latium, so in archaic times, where the Gauls were fighting against the Romans. And so the question is, these people were the same Italian Romans of the later times. So what the hell does this even mean? What it's supposed to point out? I thought this was about phenotypic references and this sense of otherness in terms of Nordic types. I didn't know that now we should consider Nordic types as, not sustaining heat for some reason, right? And we all know, again, I think Metatron knows this. I mean, I can't think that he doesn't. So I'm not saying that he's being unfair here, he's trying to trick us at all, right? But the point is logical here. What's the point of this reference? Those guys could fight in terrific heat, even, I don't know, if you go to Germany or to Britain, in summer, it's freaking damn hot at times, right? So you would sweat like an animal in any case, and this would be the case for the same Romans. Like, it's not that the Romans sweat less than the barbarians. As a matter of fact, actually, being clothed mostly, they would feel more that compared to guys that at times fought even naked. So the question to me is all very, very weird, right? And so, yes, the Metatron says, this is a description of the Battle of the Colli Albani from 367 BC for your reference. Well, yes, and it would have been better if it had not been thrown around, in my opinion. Then he goes on and says, the very white but specifically candid complexion of the Nordic people is considered to be so distant from the common looks of the Roman people that it is in fact used by Petronius in his Satyricon, where we find something very, and the Metatron places an emphasis on very, interesting. This is a camouflage scene. Petronius writes, consider the plan, it's a character speaking, I've discovered Eumolpus certainly has some ink. Let's change our skin color from hair to nails with his paint in the guise of Ethiopian slaves. We will surely serve you without painful feats. We will fool our enemies with a charge of skin color. Here's another character reply to this proposal. Oh, really, why not also circumcise us so that we can seem to be Jews, pierce our ears so that we may imitate Arabs, or whiten our faces with chalk so he thinks that we are citizens of Gaul. And then he ends, as if color alone could hide our looks. And here, Metatron inexplicably says, checkmate. Checkmate of what, exactly? So here you have some guys pulling a trick or something, right? By changing appearance to look like other people's, right? So one guy essentially paints himself black, right, to be an Ethiopian. Another says we could circumcise ourselves like we are Jews, and who's going to check that in a decent society, or even imitate the Arabs because they wear the earrings? And how's that racial, right? How's that phenotypical? Or right? And then it says we can whiten our faces with chalk, so he thinks that we are citizens of Gaul. Now, as I already explained, I don't think there is any sort of strange idea into realizing that it's incredibly difficult even today to pick, I don't know, a random person from, say, Italy and a random person from France, and ipso facto saying, oh my god, this guy, the guy from France must be just such a white guy, and the one from Italy must be just such a dark guy. You can immediately say who they are. Right, this is not going to happen. It's likely true in a absolute sense, but in relative terms, you can easily find, I don't know, the whitest Italian guy, even from Sicily. Right, the Metatron is Sicilian apparently, and I think in Italian culture it's pretty well known that one of the most typical Sicilian types is incredibly white. Right, they're like a Scandinavian guy, right? You know, blonde hair, blue eyes, right? I know that, I don't know, in Italian American culture, people think, okay, the guy is sort of darker, but even if you watch, I don't know, The Sopranos, etc., there is the even Irish actor that is used to still be the typical blonde, very blonde and very blue-eyed Southern Italian guy. And it's not that rare at all, right? It's actually easy, right? It's even a type per se. And easily you can find a French guy, an average French guy has dark hair, dark eyes, and it's going to be overall the majority, right? And so what's the point of this? They were saying, basically, we think that the Gauls look very white, all right. Proof that this is the case eventually at the time, solely on this statement, nobody knows. And it's a myth, like the Gaul is a trope. It is the sense of the guy from the north that smashes things and that echoes in the Roman sagas, right, as the giant guy. Except some of these people were at that point saying Italians living in Italy, identifying as Romans, right, and didn't even remember or have trace of the fact that their ancestors were Celts, right, and surely were very white Italian Romans that were just so because were of Italic Indo-European descent, without mentioning that even before the Indo-Europeans, of course, there were people with blue eyes, etc., but it's another story. So the guy says, we're just masquerading. Let's masquerade like a Gaul. It's as if today you dress up like Obelix, right? That's the same value that I give to this, and it's a beautiful quote, don't get me wrong. Petronius, the Satyricon, is very fun, it's very nice, but checkmate, I don't understand at all what's supposed to be exactly, right? In any case, he says, what's funny is that this debunks a whole series of characteristics falsely attributed to the ancient Romans with the aim of claiming what is otherwise historically unclaimable by certain people. What, for example, what I just said, that this was a masquerade based on a sort of racial stereotype, and that this, of course, has nothing to do with the possible maintenance by some degree just of some greater phenotype by people that had once descended from conquerors that were mostly like fair-haired and blue-eyed, and that were anthropologically associated with that, and whose language these guys collectively had started speaking. Why? Right? That's a legitimate question, I think, because it's not, again, that we can simply demonstrate that was the case, but we easily find parallels with this. Again, I say it, I'm a medievalist, so I say it always for the Middle Ages, and it shouldn't be overpronounced, right? But if you look throughout Italian literature, for example, especially the great chroniclers of the 13th and 14th century, you see that people were fixated with the appearance, with blue eyes, with fair hair. We were talking about Gatta Melata just the other day. The same thing for Castruccio, the same thing for Cangrande. It's all things that I studied, for example, for my military history in depth. And you realize that the sort of beauty, right, of the French, the German mercenaries, that people looked at physical appearance because it was a value. Like, I don't know, the German Polish knights at Legnica were people that, differently from their Mongol counterparts, thought that, I don't know, having long, flowing blonde hair was a matter of pride. And this dated back. You read the sagas, the Norse, etc. Why this wouldn't have been the case even for the ancient Indo-European rulers, and why this could have not maintained a bias even among the Italics in Italy? Right? This is a question that is legitimate because you don't have to demonstrate it. You have to assess the plausibility of this. And quoting a passage and pretending checkmate and saying, "Oh my God, this is the actual proof that what." I don't think there is legitimately a person who thought, an educated person at least, that, and especially those even that whose works is being criticized as very biased, but that actually thought that Italics were, in the moment of the migration, merely just Nordic people, right? Because, for many reasons, by the way, even if they had come from Scandinavia or Central Europe at that point, there were still these people were mixed with other non-Indo-Europeans that inhabited there before. So I reject the premise of this video. I think it's just a sort of an excuse, right? Or at least a lazy answer, because Metatron does make his homework for his videos, and I hope there could be more of this, and sort of in a more methodologically cogent way. He says, we also see with this very passage, oh my god, the Satyricon again, that not only they weren't as white as the Nordic, but they also weren't black. Okay. Well, yes, because here he says, considering the fact that I've talked about that extensively on this platform for this time will supersede. Yes, because recently he uploaded a video that was debunking one of those horrifying Afrocentric black suprematistic videos of a guy that is a total idiot, differently from the Metatron, and that it's objectively disgusting. But here, in part it's the point, I think, that nobody really made fully the point that was a full ethnic replacement of the Italians, especially because the Italians had, say, been conquered after the Roman Empire also by sizable amount of Germanic peoples, so that could have been used as an anti-narrative. In fact, many 19th century racists were pointing that out. Many Italian racists as well, many German racists at the time, as you know, were classifying people within the population, especially after the Italian unification. They were making new sort of stats on the entire people. It said they were racistically distinguishing, of course, the sort of Nordic types from the darker ones. There were many different ones, and there are obscure pages of European history, but even, I don't know, the same racial criteria of the Nazis even. The Nazis counted formally, at least because it was convenient for them, the Italians as white people, for example, which some of these authors, of course, wouldn't, or many, I don't know, think about the Italian-American, the Italian immigrants in the U.S. and what was the generic sense. Legally, they were white, but not many people would consider them exactly white, even though many of those Italians were actually blonde and blue-eyed. In Brazil, they were actually in the same years called expressly to, quote, whiten the race compared to Brazil. So it's I think it's very interesting. It's a very interesting topic, but again, I don't like how this thing here is handled. And the Metatron says, it's again, the punchline he uses. I don't like the concept. It is specifically understood that they weren't as white as the Nordic. They weren't Nordic. All right, we understood that. But still there were Nordic people among the Romans as well, and we must understand whether there was some connection whatsoever in this settlement dynamic. I mean, there are studies on this. It's very interesting and important because there are islands in Italy of white, blonde hair, blue-eyed concentration that definitely follow a pattern. For example, the Alpine arc and the Apenninic one, right? Also in the south. So why, right? I know, actually, I can give an answer, but this is not the video for. Just let's go to the end. He says, the very recognizable elements of the northern phenotypes are used as caricatures, as this happens often in the classics. So, making my point, of course. It is clear that the very white skin and blonde or red hair with blue eyes were not common nor natural. Now, this is terrifying. What was not natural for a Romano-Italic person, being blonde hair, blue-eyed? Or even if it was meant to be supernatural, if they really believed this was superior, right? Maybe, but because they did go close to this. If you look, as we will see now, at the incidence of blue eyes, for example, in the Roman deities, and how much were counted by the Romans as such, to them evidently was important. But you cannot absolutely say on any phenotypic anthropometric data that blue eyes or blonde or red hair were not common or natural in the eyes of the Roman people of the early empire. They're really common. Again, 1/3, 1/5 respectively. And I will not even comment on the natural, because here it does sound disturbing. I mean, one cannot go out there on the internet and claiming these things as if, and presenting this as the truth, right? This is heavy stuff, and in the bad way. And I respect the Metatron's work, but I must say that forcefully. he says, but let's move on from the literary evidence to the iconographic one, and let's have a look at Pompeii's frescoes. So, he says, these represent members of the Roman aristocracy in the 1st century AD, and we did see people with white skin, but not of the Nordic type. Why? The hair, he says, is normally black or brown, that is normal within the Roman Empire. To be very picky, and here we start having some technical references, in the Pompei picture, first of all, this is the only picture that he comments on iconographically on the entire and massive evidence of early imperial stuff. And in the Pompei frescoes, 3/4 of the pictures portrays what I would easily say they're fair individuals, right? They have sort of brown reddish hair even, right? And they are 3/4 of the pictures. And the Metatron shows just a sort of darker, sort of thick-browed one, just to say this is what the Romans were like. Sorry, but have you actually given a look at that picture? That is, by the way, those people represented there, the 3/4, are actually fairer than the average contemporary Italian, for sure, first of all. Secondly, if you told me, look, those women represented there are, that also Metatron shows in the picture, they are Swedish today, I would say, yeah, I mean, that fits. They're substantially, I mean, very even fair-skinned. They have this sort of reddish hair. They look also, in their skeleton somehow compatible, the proportions, the size, etc. How is this evidence here proving any of the point? It's actually showing substantially fair people. I don't see dark prevalence there at all. So it's very strange to me to make this point, especially at the beginning of the video, making people bait saying, all the available, reliable evidence. Are you freaking kidding me? I will just quote some literary stuff later that will clarify a bit things. He says, these represent members of the Roman aristocracy in the 1st century AD, and we did people with white skin, but not of the Nordic type. Why? Right? They could be... What do you think by Nordid, by the way? Because Nordid doesn't mean the albino pictures that you put there, right? Nordid people can be, I don't know. I was about to get married with a Serbian woman who was blonde and blue-eyed. She had typical strong Nordid traits. She surely had some Avar there too. But she was, I would consider her fairly Nordid. Also, she was pretty big, let's say, in size. In height, and why not, right? Could she be, say, Italian? Yeah, she could easily be Italian as well. She could be, I mean, what's the point of the Pompei frescoes there, right? How do they have to look like? Also because they were not fixated really too much. This is actually a point against the Nordicism of it all, right? The Romans do not evidently display a full obsession towards extreme whiteness. And this may have been also because there weren't so many Romans that would make that justified, like looking like that. But overall, it's also because it was pretty common to see, I don't know, a blonde haired or blue-eyed Italic, not even, I don't know, one of Celtic, an Italian of Celtic descent, right? But it could be even a Greek. Like there were, I don't know, lots of Hellenic colonists in southern Italy that were blue-eyed. Why should we, and would have even looked Nordic, as there are many Greeks that do, right? Even though the majority of them is definitely dark. So I don't get this point either, and it's not that, again, the rarity, right? Because also the Metatron drops this up towards the end and says, of course, well, there are exceptions. Yes, but they're not so statistical. Like, it's not that there is one blonde-haired person every, I don't know, 20 people. That's not how it works, right? It's actually much more shaded, and exactly because people were that fair from a very, or dark, in that balance for a very long time, and people sort of mix. And so the fact that there are still also people in which that sort of fairness is concentrated with that frequency, that ratio that we said before, actually should make the point somehow. And then he says this, it's in fact on the 4th century, in the 4th century AD, that people with blonde hair start to appear more often in the iconography, as we see in the mosaics of the Villa Romana del Casale in Sicily, when the Roman military system begins to be strongly influenced by elements originated from the Barbarica. I would give that as an explanation. It could easily be also say connected with different cultural ideas, maybe a bit more of oligarchization, and so this sort of need to aristocratize the solar cult. You start seeing swastikas. It could have to do more with that. The search for what before was considered as the moral standard, and now things were sort of going down, so they were reinsisting on the external side of the ideology, even reproducing these phenotypes. But yes, let's agree on this. Now, the Metatron says that we have established the norm. Again, if the norm is, the majority had sort of dark hair and dark eyes, yes, but not in the sense that it would be the norm that these people thought that it was uncommon or unnatural to be blonde or blue-eyed, right? As an ethnic Italic from the early, say Augustan times or before or afterwards. The Metatron says we also need to spend a couple of words to identify the fact that yes, some variables and some occasional situations where you had red hair, blue eyes, or some occasional situations, like, as if, again, 1/3 or 1/5 respectively was some occasional situation, as if it was an anomaly for, I don't know, an Italic to be blonde, blue-eyed. This is not the case, evidently. And this it did indeed happen within the Roman world. Well, thanks my eyes. What do you think that the Roman world was? It was plenty of people that had commonly these phenotypes. So I don't understand even how one could conceive that in Europe, right, on the northern shores of the Mediterranean, one could consider these colors sort of an anomaly, and not something, again, part of the very ethnic substratum of the local populations as a normal thing. When I say normal, I mean because it's not an exception, not normal in the sense that it's 50%, right? It's normal. Well, if you say, I don't know, look at this guy, he's walking down the street, he's a red hair, oh, so what's wrong with that? Is it strange? Like, I don't know, I don't think it's strange, personally, when I see anywhere in Europe, even in Southern Europe, so I don't, it can be more or less frequent in different countries. This is of course, an important discussion one could have, but if you look at the actual ratios, that's definitely not, an anomaly in some way. And the Metatron says, and some of these traits were also present on a smaller number within the Roman emperors. Oh, surprise, surprise, why shouldn't have they been? But there is something I need to tell you, which is from a linguistic perspective that can shed light on something that could be otherwise be misleading. Oh my god, let's see what's happening. This. According to Suetonius, Nero is described as having grey bluish eyes, according to Pliny. Right? Let's remember that he descended from the Ainobarbi, so those who had literally, copper-like reddish beards. But again, it's a name. I'm not making the case that, because this is what I find myself to hear counter as a method, right? But just observing that I'm not the one who thinks that this is, say, there are strange things happening with somebody with this kind of colors. Emperor Octavianus had gray-green eyes. Yes, notoriously. Then here he quotes John Malalas, which Metatron in fact calls throughout the entire video as Malasas, right? I'm not a Byzantinist, but I think everybody was familiar with the sort, we would say, with Byzantine literature, or just their time being, knows that it's Malalas, not Malasas. Well, repeated over and over again, it's not just a lapsus, it's just the guy has never really handled that literary dimension. So Malalas, not Malassas, tells us, so this is a later source, by the way. It's practically an early medieval Syrian source, right, Byzantine one, that tells us that Emperor Commodus has blonde hair, Metatron says. And what's the value of this? Like, even if, okay, we have historians, just like for Petronius, we have historians telling us this. What's the reliability of Malalas? It may be high, right? We often have this problem with ancient sources that we do not know what their sources in turn were, right? And so that's why we quote them directly, because that's all we know very often. We can have an idea about the context, but still a lot, unfortunately, has gone lost. Yeah, right. Commodus, let's imagine, he had blonde hair. So, yeah, how is it strange, right? And it says, and once again, Suetonius describes the beard of Caligula as being aurea. Yeah, so golden. Yeah, all right. Again, is it strange for a Roman emperor to have blonde hair for some reason? So golden, still the reason why this doesn't validate the theory of a Nordic ruling elite is the fact that we also have completely opposite examples. Yes, and that's exactly the point I'm making. Like, you have opposite examples that people surprised that emperors, some had black hair and somebody had blonde hair. How does this help, right? Do we have a statistic demographic evidence of the distribution of these colors, especially after we have ascertained that what is obvious, that of course that there wasn't a major ethnic replacement from ancient times to contemporary times in Europe. I don't know what's the point of this all, right? It says, for instance, according to Suetonius, Julius Caesar had black penetrating eyes. First of all, it's a bit more complex than that, but again, the sense, again, that Suetonius says Caesar had black eyes, how does it tell us what Caesar actually looked like? Right? What's the actual reliability of this information, just in a punctiform individual way? Caesar, for example, had also pale skin. That's what the sources say, which would have not been strange, right? That Caesar had properly black eyes is strange because, you know, it's very rare to have properly and literally black eyes, right? That's something that here I didn't bother to check the reference in Latin, but the point is also what should we care about in this sense, even in a bigger concept. Vespasian's eyes were the color of red wine, so very dark that we have the exact same description of eye for Antoninus Pius. Then he says again, Malalas also tells us that Hadrian had black hair but bright eyes, but the linguistic note that I was telling you about is the fact that the Romans used two different... this is complete BS, right? I'm sorry to be vulgar here, but being polite, but it's after... I don't know how he came up with this, but as we will see now, the thing is not true. And this is what Metatron says, that the Romans used two different Latin terms to describe the blonde color of the Celts and then the blonde color of these emperors. Now, I would like to hear the proof of this, just because we don't have this actual evidence at all, right? This is in the Aeneid, all the characters are blonde. Lavinia, Aeneid 12:605, Filia prima manu Flavos Lavinia crinis et roses leaniata genes, right? Some say it's Florus, not Flavus, but the same Aeneas that is inspiring nobility in the face, in the hair as ivory surrounded with gold, right? This is 1592. Aut ubi flavo argentum pariusque lapis circondatur auro, right? Iulus, Mercury in his appearance. This is 4559 et Acrinis Flavus et membra decora juventa, right? There is an Ausonian, so an Italian warrior in 562 that is the Fulvus Camers, right? By the way, the most remarkable thing is that none of the warriors of the other characters of the Aeneid had black hair. This is Virgil, right? So what is the story about Flavus being just used for the barbarians, right? This is pretty weird, to say the least, and just outright wrong. So we're going to uncover the truth or telling what here, right? And here he goes a great length to explain that, you know, the says the subflavum for emperors, which is a subcategory, could be interpreted as a light brown, what we in Italian today call castano chiaro. Right, so first of all, people that have light brown hair tend to be, generally speaking, say, tending towards a sort of Nordic standard, I think, right? There are different shades, of course, from full blonde to something that is you can appear as blondish before being somehow brownish in some way. I had different girlfriends. One was, in fact, Northern French. She was half Belgian, 1/4 German, 1/4 Spanish, and she was, say, almost blonde, right? Because she had so much light brown hair that you couldn't quite tell fully that the case. The same goes for my Polish ex. I couldn't say she was properly blonde because she's like a typical Pole, but it's just slightly light brown for not being blonde. So the question here is, what the hell are we talking about? Flavus was used, of course, for describing Roman characters, right? So what the Metatron is saying here is just what's the count just of the emperors will look like that, because we have to make the point for the elite. Well, why was Virgil using that cultural standard then? Why is that for the Romans was it important to say that they were blonde, right? There is a religious, spiritual meaning behind that I hinted at before. I'm not going to make the video about because it's already as long as it is. But, for example, speaking of the physical ideal of some poets, Tibullus tells us of a blonde Delia, Ovid of a blonde Corinna, Propertius of a blonde Cynthia. Ovid says in his Ars Amandi 11,657 that si nigra est fusca vocatur, that is to say, was applying properly a negative character to darkness. And so this woman was actually not for his standards because of that. This is harsh. Again, Horace says explicitly to be aware of darker people. Beware darker people. Juvenal tells us of a Flava Puella Ogulnia that came from a noble stock. So this is absolutely and downright wrong. Flavus was used for describing blonde Romans, and it's not all, right? There are interesting figures like, I don't know, Lucius Cornelius Sulla was exceptionally fair-skinned. He had piercing gray eyes and reddish hair. The Metatron here makes the point that, yes, the fact that somebody was exceptional in this sense was probably an indicator not everybody was like that. Absolutely, I think that too. For example, in the Aeneid, coming back to it, 692, you have Proserpina that took off, at the moment of that, the blonde hair that everybody would have to bring on their head, right? So this definitely is not talking about particularly dark-haired people on average. In the Ovidian fasts, we have heroes and heroines, right? Of the Roman antiquity as blonde people, right? This work had a specific archaeological and celebrational value, right? Lucretia, for example, is blonde when she is liked by Tarquinius, right? in 763 says forma placet niveusque color flavique capilli, right? The sons of Mars, Romulus and Remus, are blonde. Now, it's useless for me to make all examples, but you understand that this story that the Flavian was just used for the Celts. What? You know. So, and the explanation, by the way, of Metatron is that, you know, it's not that it was a specific term that for some reason people said, well, we should call the Celts, even if they're blonde, with a different name. It's just actually saying that between Flavus and Subflavus, you have actually a different shading color. So it's as if to say the Romans couldn't have a Flavian outlook except these examples that I just provided that outnumber even the ones that Metatron has provided just by itself. You know, if you just have to make an iron arm, it's saying otherwise. And again, this is not Nordicism, this is just what they wrote about themselves. So if this is the criterion that Metatron is using, which I also disagree on, honestly, well, still it debunks the story that, especially, again, this distinction is completely wrong, right? There is no doubt that the Celts and Germans would have looked blonder, bluer-eyed, etc. than the Romans. You know, the Romano-Italic word, there is no doubt, all right? But to sort of draw this divide between them is, I think, I don't know, I don't want to qualify it because otherwise it wouldn't be that nice, but how can this be spread? As a matter of fact, do you realize how many people are going to repeat this over because Metatron said that? Right, and just because this is the guy who makes things right? Right, this is just, it took me just a simple search. It's not that they had to do much, you know, that they make Roman history and more, but I think this is so simple. What was the preparation of this video, honestly? In any case, Metatron goes on, says a different term for a different chromatic variety. It is also interesting to mention that sometimes the Romans use fantastical explanation for this, very foreign according to their point of view, phenotypic traits. This is not quite true. Again, you start to using a sort of carnivalesque categorization that only with a very narrow select of sources that push that trope, but you have never even quoted Virgil here, that is obviously telling something else. And even if it hadn't been true, right, the question is, you have to answer as I would on the basis of why they said that. I think that's extremely important. It can't be just a fashion, a taste. This is exactly a point of meaning, right, and value, right? You have Silius Italicus, we're talking about the early empire, right? He says that the Latin generation of Republican times took up arms, even before, as young as they were, that the flava lanugo, in fact, would emblondish their cheeks. Silius Italicus, Punica 11,319. In the Sibylline Oracles, 14,346, you find the blonde heads, Xantha Carena, of the Roman soldiers. Right? What about this? What about this? Right? Is this not actual evidence of the Romans actually saying explicitly that their soldiery, their youth, was blondish? Again, I'm not making the point that literally all of these were. What I make the point in is that, of course, there was a substantial amount of normally recognized blonde italics and blue-eyed italics, and that the Romans were interested in sort of these colors in general because they reminded them of the golden divine standard. Right? So they thought to be whiter legitimately also the darker populations of southern Italy, for example, as italics. Well, of course, southern Italy was also italic in the interland, but I mean, there was the sense, for example, that the Graeculi, again, were something smaller and weaker, and there are as the same Metatron actually posted in other videos, complaining about legitimately that against all that sort of black washing of the Roman Empire that is complete and utter nonsense, that it's plenty of evidence actually showing that the Romans associated with black phenotype sort of negative moral traits. This is actually, if anyone has a basic knowledge of Latin literature, knows this, right? If people, the masses, are radically underschooled and they were not provided with a first world primary education, it's not my fault, it's not the Metatron's fault. It's just history, right? And there is nothing you can do to change that, right? Then again, the Metatron says, let's read this other thing. One day, this is a story, right? He was returning, as a guy, in the countryside. Lucius, right, met two twins, ordered him to tell the Senate and the people about a victory that still hadn't occurred and demonstrate him their divinity. They touched his cheeks, changing the color of his beard and his hair from black to red like copper. Metatron says this would be yet another confirmation that the Nordic phenotypic type does not necessarily belong to the ruling elite, right? This is okay, but still the fact that this beard would turn red, right, has a meaning, right, for the Romans, evidently. And speaking of red beards, the Metatron says we have the gens Rufia. Clearly the founder of this family would have had red hair, not necessarily actually, right? They may have been, of course, and this would have made them even Proto-Celtic, maybe. Again, that's where most of you find the color. But they're exactly like in the previous example, and this is a point the Metatron could have made to make his point, actually, that if red or blonde was something to be achieved in a, say, improvement, this clan could have called themselves like this, even if they were not necessarily redheads, right? But I give the Metatron that this is possible, but the same point is, because he will see it now, he says this is a plebeian low class sort of family, so nothing whatsoever to do with the likes of the gens Julia. Well, we have actually extensive etymological and onomastic evidence that today will not digress on, of the sort of there is not just hair or eyes, there is also the size of the body and height, right? And it's plenty in the among these Roman clans of such etymologies connected to a sort of northern phenotype, right? This doesn't mean again that they were altogether even just elite, but it may be possible that they had maintained the obvious idea that they didn't need to explicitate because the world basically revolved around such correspondence between the spirit and the matter, at least if the former was not able to transfigure the latter. They didn't have to explain to us, like many things that we know about the ancient world, but that were not explicitated at the time, because guess what? They didn't need even to tell that. So he says names such as Flavus does not mean blonde and Rufus does not mean red on one hand. So yes, he makes the point to demonstrates the presence of some of these colors within the Roman world, but on the other hand it also determines the peculiar characteristics of it. And this is actually shooting on your own foot. What about Eric the Red? What was the point of calling somebody the Red in the Viking world if it was actually pretty common to see a red-haired person? So you're actually trying to make the point, at least, that if somebody calls you blonde or red is, I know that you're saying here that you're fighting against, I think, an imaginary enemy that thinks that every single Roman elite was blonde or red-haired, and I don't think that even the harshest white supremacists would actually claim something like that. But what about the same among very varied people, like, again, Eric the Red, here the Tall, or whatever? It's, yes, it is a way to distinguish them, but at some point it also becomes a name. Of course, it depends on, say, at the time of Eric the Red, that would be a much more spot-on nickname for the individual guy as opposed to a family. But here among the Roman gentes, that's something particularly different, right? So I don't like this specific concept. He says again, in fact, because they use them to identify them, that's what a name does. You identify someone because of a peculiar characteristic. It doesn't yes, you do, but how frequent is that characteristic? It was not that infrequent to have a blonde or red-haired italic at all. So in other words, he says, in a population that mostly has black hair, you wouldn't call someone black-haired. Well, not even in the north, the majority of people was actually blonde. There are actually names that refer to that. By the way, the Romans had terms for black-haired people, or dark-haired people. So does that mean that, when they were used, or where they were used, that was something strange as well? Nigger, for example, that's something you find even among the... I can't even believe this is a point, really. Let's be... It doesn't substantiate, of course, any kind of, statistical or genetic evidence that actually we do have, and that is somehow interesting after all, because, again, as that study that the same Metatron mentions, turns out that basically modern Italians look pretty much like they did in Roman times, and yeah, we can see that there is a substantial amount of blondes and red hair, blue-eyed, green-eyed, and so on. So he says other things like Vitruvius said that the directo capillo, so straight hair, was the norm among the Gauls, for example. Yes, okay, but this could also be like the thing that was said about the Romans in those passages before. It can be an exaggeration. How do you distinguish that? What actual proof does Vitruvius have for his statement? That's what we do in history. We don't repeat big single information from the supermarket of quotes, right? We actually contextualize that, which is also what the Metatron said. And again, he says, and won't you know it, Crixus becomes a name which means curly head because it's not the norm. Well, curly hairs existed pretty much everywhere. It might have not been the norm, but again, is it something so strange to see even among sort of blonde people? So it's very strange. He says, another very interesting social cultural phenomenon that happened during this time that can help us understand and pinpoint the extravagance of blonde hair. Again, there was no extravagance of blonde hair among the Romano-Italic population. Virgil said that literally, again, all those heroes at the foundation of Rome were blonde. So what kind of extravagance was it? And how was that a sort of negative thing? Because the inherent line here in the Metatron's video is that not just it was that the Romans would find this, allegedly, this blonde hair, red hair, etc. uncommon, but that there was something sort of strange and sort of slightly negative into them. That's not the case, right? He says this, the fact that we know, because it's mentioned that several Roman citizens, mostly women, imported wigs from Gaul, from Gallia, he says, that were made with blonde hair of some of the Celtic inhabitants. So some Roman women, particularly in the upper class, fancied the blonde hair and paid good money to get these wigs. Now there's a my here, sorry, because the transcription is sort of weird, but I fixed it with the video, that is connected to this, that tells that you'll find it in all sorts of websites on the internet. As yes, this is a rumor which says that it was a law in Rome or a requirement for all prostitutes to wear blonde wigs, and it's a myth. I could not find any form of evidence to back this up historically, so what probably is the case is that these were mostly ordered by wealthy Roman women, the most famous of which was Empress Messalina, but because she was a little extravagant from a sexual point of view, the connection was made. But it's not a connection that is backed up historical, so it's possible that a few, let's say, more expensive prostitutes did buy the wigs to please their customers. Absolutely very possible, but when websites do tell you that this was a requirement, no, it wasn't. Yeah, okay, so they imported blonde, presumably also red-haired wigs made out of actual hair from people from Gaul, Germany, etc. To have that. Yeah, okay, because yes, those peoples were definitely fairer than the Romans. Alright, and it was just given just knowing the spirit of Roman literature. This is a sort of slightly negative criticism of this sort of sort of low aesthetical concerns, while the good times were over, so the true values were not there. So this also the prostitute thing is a myth, so there is apparently not really a negative bias here. It's actually that seemingly women liked to be blonde. And yes, this actually continues during the Middle Ages too, right? It says, reading over on the matter, ever since the auburn hair of German women had become known in Rome, Roman ladies were widely eager to have such hair instead of their own black locks. And here the Metatron is very honest. He says, he also wrote that women chose bright colors to harmonize a contrast with their hair. However, he took this from the book of Otto Kiefer about sexual life in ancient Rome, and the Metatron points out rightly that the original passage from Ovid, from which the author took this from, does not say that the Roman women had actually lock of black hair, right? It's just obvious that it wasn't blonde, right? Otherwise, what would be the point of putting a blonde wig, he says. But it's important to underline this. So this is also true, and this is correct. But it doesn't say that, they were in need of these wigs, because yes, the majority of Italian women would have been dark-haired, but there would have been still Italian blonde women that could have also provided those wigs, as a matter of fact. So the Metatron drops it up, says, when it comes to the following interpretation and discussion on the genetic relevance and variance and changes throughout the centuries in Italy, there are multiple studies, but this one specifically that I'd like to mention briefly here to discuss and justify with data my claim that the Italian population hasn't really changed from an ethnic and genetic perspective throughout the centuries. What do you mean by ethnic and genetic? Exactly, right? By ethnic specifically, if you pair them in this way. Of course, ethnic can have a broader cultural meaning, but to which extent, what are you referring? Because of course that did change, at least in any case, centuries that other people claim. This is absolutely true. We live in a world in which, again, I think the majority of people truly believes that Italians comes into a standard pack of black-haired, short, darker skinned, dark-eyed way, and that it's so strange and abnormal to think that there is a blonde or blue-eyed one, while it's actually pretty much self-evident. Part of the reason, evidently not the case, part of the reason of this, I think, it's that Italy is internationally filtered from an ethical point of view from the mafia movies made in the United States about Italian Americans that at large came from southern Italy and appeared, of course, much darker than the wasps, right? But aside from the fact that that's the darkest part of Italy, the question is that there are still not particularly different ratios of blonde or blue-eyed people, right? Overall, yes, because let's consider this, that the phenotype is one thing, the genotype is another. So you can easily have, say, a blonde person, but with otherwise significantly Mediterranean or darker complexion, for example. So that does change. Of course, northern Italians are much fairer in many ways, and it's something that you cannot just stop to hair and eyes. It's it's height that here we didn't discuss. It's skin color, of course. It's skeleton. It's facial traits. It's all something that, again, was particularly studied by the same Nordicists who were obsessed with these things back in the day. But it's also a real thing. I mean, these differences do exist. But again, if you look at the overall Italian picture, and you consider also that they weren't, say, that the population didn't change so much after all over the centuries, and surely would, but for the simple reason that Italy was overwhelmingly populated, right? It was much easier to alter the ethnic background of Britain during the Viking era than Italy at any time in its history, till today with mass immigration, right? So, again, if you look at ethnic Italians, they're still today easily to be found as blonde or blue-eyed without having to, search in the crowds desperately. It's again, I think every class in every school class, every bus, every place, has, I don't know, but that's 1/3 of sort of blondish people, and it's actually blondish, like not full blonde, absolutely not. But say again, all this video for say of 20 minutes actually of Metatron's video for saying what exactly? What he says here, history of Rome was laid out by researchers at Stanford University that studies relevant to our discussion, because what was found is that regardless of the European genetic lineages that converged into the ancient city and the limited information we have about genetic makeup of the population and its then, the results of this research demonstrate that the genetic heritage of the Italian people hasn't in fact changed. The ancient Romans were a Mediterranean people, right? And when the Metatron says this, so everything is okay with the Stanford University thing, and it's not, in fact, as he says, the only study that I think it's also pretty notorious to anyone who studies history to conceptualize the fact that there is most of the times in this context, especially of fully sedentarized sort of fertile areas, etc., a dramatic genetic continuity with previous times. But the sense that there is a Mediterranean people, this is something I thoroughly dislike, and I explain why. I just finished because the Metatron says the ancient Romans were a Mediterranean people and have been at least since the Chalcolithic, which is also substantiated by the studies made by Cavalli Sforza, a famous ethnogenetist. So in conclusion of this study, the Roman people were a Mediterranean people. This is, again, why? Because Mediterranean people, again, think that blonde people are extravagant. Is this, the actual summary of it all? As they themselves tell us, they were not black, but they were not Nordic either. You see, they did not tell us. They were not even addressing us. So, yes, definitely the Romans were no blacks, but also they were much more not blacks than they weren't Nordic. Actually, they were as Caucasian. You would have found Nordic elements in it without much of a problem. Also, North Africa had some Nordic elements scattered. It's rarer there, definitely. Seas do connect, but they also do divide, and the Romans colonized heavily that area, by the way, so that's always something you must remember. Also for the 19th century racism, North Africa had always a ridiculous demographic capacity compared to the northern shores of the Mediterranean. So no, the Italians weren't darkened by the Arabs, by their black ghulams, etc. You do find a small percentage of that in Sicily, because, surprise, surprise, we do find the evidence of I don't know how many thousands black slaves sent as soldiers by the Aghlabites. But the question is, still, you go to Sicily and you find clamorously white people that could easily look like Danish, and they are specific Sicilian types in culture. And I think most people are not aware of this. And yes, of course, it's plain like the white majority is darker people. But again, let's rethink a bit how we think these peoples, and how there is, especially not, I firmly disagree with the Metatron, such a thing like Mediterranean peoples. Right here, the conclusion is that they were Mediterranean. Right, and especially that the evidence that the Metatron provided us was showing us that they were essentially claiming that. He basically just picked some mockery or some eccentric form, but what about the official, almost, think about DNA, etc., working that was stressing the blondness of Romans, or Silius Italicus that says that, and this sense that the Italic stock was sort of fairer than, say, what you would call the rest of the non-Indo-European ones in the Mediterranean, right? Even within the same sort of areas of Italy, they were not that. So he concludes that the results of research and data analysis seem to point to a completely different pattern of identification as that proposed by the likes of Gunther. Therefore, we consider his Nordic theory of the origins of the Roman Empire indefendable. This has nothing to do with the origins of Rome, the Roman Empire, though. This is not even an actual research or data analysis. The single most important thing, the study about the ethnic continuity, that it basically has not been analyzed. Also, just this random quotes that eliminates sort of very important ones that explicitly say that the Latin youth and heroes and the foundation of Rome were all blonde, and yes, it's a myth, etc., but it means something, right? And it is very connected with, of course, the golden race of gods from which the entire ancient world thought that humanity had fallen from, and that obviously the elite would like to be like, and possibly even selecting their elements according to that and inspiring themselves to that sort of principle. Well, that is completely missed, right? I must say that even without watching, I don't watch the Metatron regularly, but this was a topic that I wanted to analyze for quite a while. And having analyzed the speech here, I must conclude that Metatron does fall into that category of sort of normalizing, sort of in between, white supremacists are and black supremacists are bad, okay, but then what have we substantiated actually from an historical point of view here? Practically nothing, right? And actually making gross mistakes like the one of Flavus, as if the Romans were literally thinking that they couldn't be